We have never found any evidence of any human civilization that didn't have money. Money predates written language. Money's as old as belief in God, as like people staring into the stars and wondering what's out there. I think, of course, there are Chinese spies in the US government, there are Russian spies, even our allies. In 1951, Alan Turing went on a lecture tour of the UK where he was arguing that superintelligent AGI was months away. He was wrong.
Graham Moore, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
I'm really excited to have you. You've written a fascinating book about a period in time that I'm obsessed with, which is World War II. The book, The Wealth of Shadows, is about how economics were used to break the back of the Nazi war machine. Mm-hmm. I think there are fascinating parallels to what's going on today, especially in Ukraine and Russia. And I'm curious, how did the US end up beating the Nazis before they ever fired a shot?
I think that the U.S. ended up beating the Nazis long before firing a shot, thanks to a largely unheralded group of economists working under the auspices of the U.S. Treasury Department. And that's what the book is really about. I think starting in 1939, even after Germany had invaded Poland, there was this period where the United States was not just neutral in what we considered sort of this European dispute, but the United States was assiduously neutral, sort of passionately neutral. I talk about this in the book, but in 1939, even after the invasion of Poland, there was polling done, and 12% of Americans wanted to get involved in what they called the European dispute. The percentage of Americans who wanted to get involved militarily was 2%. It was politically toxic for the Roosevelt administration to not just wage any kind of war against the Nazis, but to even do anything that vaguely looked like what they were doing was waging war against the Nazis.
What year was that poll taken?
39.
So they already know about concentration camps at this point. They know the horrific conditions, and yet it was still that unpopular.
That's absolutely right. When I found those numbers, I was shocked by how small they were. It was really... The common feeling was this is a European thing. Okay, Germany invaded Poland. It's complicated. Yes, Czechoslovakia, it's complicated. They're not. Okay, the UK is going to war. Okay, France is going to war, but this is their problem. This is not our problem. This is not our problem. This is not our problem. And yet there was this group of economists and even sort of largely amateur economists working for the Treasury Department who this book is about. And these people said, no, the U.S. had passed a neutrality act. So doing anything to help the British against the Nazis or to help the French against the Nazis was illegal. It was counter to government policy. And these people at Treasury said, no, we're not doing that. This is really bad. The Nazi threat is not going to stop. It's not going to stop at Poland. It's not going to stop at Britain. It's not going to stop at France. This is going to keep happening.
Why were they so confident about that?
Because a number of things. So one of the things that I think they had done, and that we've certainly been able to prove since, is that they'd done analysis of the German war operation. And what they found was that the entire German economy had been restructured around the making of war. That is, the German government the Nazi government had completely structured its natural economy to produce one output, and that output was war. Everything, is a very kind of centrally planned economy. They were, no secret that Nazi stands for sort of, I can't speak German. If I try to do the German, it'll be a disaster, but sort of National Socialist Party of Germany. The politics of it were complicated, this kind of like extreme sort of right-wing socialism mix that was quite statist. And what the Americans had done is we'd sort of looked at this and said, this isn't going to stop. This is a real threat, and the Germans couldn't stop even if they wanted to. The German economy is built around a couple things. It's built around, one, having a slave class of Jews to perform unpaid labor. And it's built around conquest. It's built around taking new lands where they can acquire new raw materials, new money, and frankly, more slaves. And if the Nazi war machine were to stop conquering, were to stop taking new territory, the entire Nazi economy would collapse. And so any idea that they're going to stop at Czechoslovakia is ridiculous. Any idea that they're going to stop at Poland is ridiculous. Any idea that they're going to stop at France is ridiculous. This is a machine built to take land and built to steal raw materials and capture slaves. And it's going to keep doing that until one of two things happen. Either they consume the entire world or someone stops them. And so what this book is about, what The Wealth of Shadows is about this group of folks at Treasury who said, okay, we're going to be the ones to stop them.
It's a really interesting moment in the book that you tell of an economist who's basically looking at a spreadsheet and says, okay, wait a second, how did the Germans go from utterly devastated by the Treaty of Versailles, just demolished by that, demolished by the Great Depression, and now all of a sudden, in the span of a very short number of years, like two, they roar back to life with all the sanctions that say they can't build this, they can't build that, because they didn't want them to rearm themselves. And you get this economist who looks at the spreadsheet and goes, they've created, it's quite brilliant, and this is where it starts to get very unnerving for me as somebody who studies the economy. The Germans found a way basically to create a circular economy that was completely contained within Germany. So you would sell war bonds to your farmers or whatever, promise them a return, but to avoid inflation, tell them, first of all, it won't pay off for a few years. And second of all, even when it does, I'm going to restrict the amount that you can take out. But everybody's super excited because they see their net worth going up, even though in reality, they're not being allowed to spend it. And the only way that they can keep the inflation from going crazy, since they don't have economic output that they're selling, because it's all internal, is, to your point, we have to go to the next conquest and on and on and on. And that tautology is what I worry about today. And so when you look at how they used economics, they tried to cut Germany off from the international money supply. They went to Brazil and tried to buy up all the iron and cotton to make sure they couldn't make bullets and uniforms. So they're doing all of these economic things. But what does that tell us about what's likely going on today when we look at how we're positioning ourselves against Russia with Ukraine? Technically, we're not in the fight, but we're doing these economic things. What's your read on that?
So it's a great question. And my read is that the set of techniques that the United States and the European Union have been using against Russia these past few years are essentially the modern versions of a set of techniques developed by this group of people at Treasury in 1939. This was a set of techniques that we now call economic warfare that really was developed in the late 30s and early 40s. I would argue that economic warfare hadn't really been tried before this. Sanctions existed, but sanctions are a very small part of, I think, the economic warfare package that's presently being used, and that was certainly being used in the 30s and 40s. Because, just as you're saying, I think a big part of the anti-Nazi economic warfare of 39, 40, and 41, and of what the US and the EU are doing against the Russian government today is trying to sever those economies from the rest of the world. The problem is both the German economists in the 30s and the Russian economists in the last decade prepared for this. And I think we can see, one of the other eerie corollaries between the late 30s and now is, so you were just talking about this period in the mid 30s where the brilliant German economists sort of rebuilt the German economy from nothing. After Versailles, Germany it's no secret that they were kind of doomed to decades of poverty thanks to these crushing sanctions, these crushing debts after the war. Germany in the early 30s was this economic backwater. By 38, 39, they'd built the largest military in the world in, just as you said, only a few years. How did they do it? It was pretty brilliant. And I suppose doesn't need clarifying that it's brilliant/evil, because as I said, the slave class was an important part of that operation. It doesn't work without essentially these work camps of forced labor. But as you're saying, they developed this complicated bond system to effectively make it look, kind of funnel more and more of what was effectively German GDP into the military than it looked like they were doing. The term GDP didn't quite exist yet, and actually we get into that in the book. It was sort of being invented around the same time. But basically a significant percentage of everyone's labor and everyone's money in Germany was getting put into the war machine, and it then appeared to be going to it. But at the same time, everyone was putting their money in the banks. The banks were sort of, to simplify, the banks were secretly funneling that money to the German military, but it looked like everyone would check their bank deposit books and they had all this money in the bank and they were making all these returns, and banks were offering 4%, 5% returns in these checking accounts, which looked, for Germany at the time, was wildly high. It looked great. Everyone thought they were getting rich. Only, just as you pointed out, there was one trick. They couldn't withdraw the money. The German government had passed a set of laws such that it was against the law to withdraw too much money from your checking account. But then again, why would you? Because leaving the money there made it grow, and you kept getting these statements that made it look like it was growing. In a sense, that it was some bizarre combination of like Ponzi scheme and kind of wild military expansion. But at the same time, the Germans knew that with a coming war, they needed to create this autarkic system. They needed to sever the German economy from the rest of the world, because they were going to, soon enough, they were going to go to war with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. They were going to then not be able to trade with those countries. They knew that they weren't going to be able to trade in dollars very soon. They weren't going to be able to trade in sterling very soon. They weren't going to be able to trade in francs very soon when they started going to war with the countries producing those currencies. So they began this process of trying to sort of sever themselves from the global economy. Now, if you look at the last 10 years, you can certainly see a set of Russian economists doing the exact same thing. You can see them understanding that they don't need to they've done a couple of other things. They kept pretty significant, the Russians, I guess in contrast to the Germans, I should clarify, have kept quite extensive dollar reserves. And at the same time, they have something even more valuable, which is they have oil reserves, which allows them to acquire dollars or other currencies on the global market and kind of keep trading with enough of the world that even if the US shuts them off and says, we're not going to trade with you anymore, even if the EU shuts them off and says, we're not going to trade with you anymore, other places will. And so you see a kind of preparation. What you find is that in both the 30s and in the last decade is that the economists were planning for the war many years before the military was.
What I find most interesting about your book is there's this sense of we have a moral agenda and we're going to weaponize money as a way to get this done. Mm-hmm. And before reading your book, I would have agreed with the sentiment of when you look at a government, you should say, look, it's hard to get things done because there's this managerial class. It's bureaucrats pushing paper and they bog things down. But reading your book, I would say, this is a contentious statement, but the idea of a deep state is a wiser way to look at it, because there are people in the government working at intentional cross purposes to the stated mission of the president, of the National Declaration of Neutrality. You have in your book, again, the book is based on a true story.
That's right.
One of the true stories is that the guy running the Treasury department that's in charge of this war effort is also a Russian spy. And so I was like, whoa, it gave this sense of the government is not a bunch of bumbling bureaucrats. The government is actually made up of people with competing ideologies that are going to war with each other inside the government itself to pull historical events in a given direction. And then that sets the stage for we are maybe not at maximum division because we're not in a civil war and we know we've had one. So there is worse places to be than where we are now.
Well put.
But we are at a time of very heightened division, which tells me within the government, there will be massive division. And then we have our former presidents stating, hey, there's a very bad thing happening inside the government, which is that they were pulling in directions that I did not want them pulling in. And so I look at divided sentiment over Russia, Ukraine. I look at your book and say, I look at your book and I say, there is a very complicated thing happening in terms of what I'll round to the deep state. And so what do you think becomes the outcome of this reality of how governments operate in today's context?
I feel like in some ways you're burying the lead here, because I feel like you're saying that the book has sold you, Tom, on bureaucrats. And I'm proud to say that I could be the one to prove the value of bureaucrats the world over. I think, yes, I think I don't... Yes, the word deep state is a loaded term, but I think it is absolutely true that what this book gets into is that in 39, 40, 41, 42, throughout the war, there were different groups of competing teams of people within the US government with very different aims from what the government's kind of stated goal was and what the president was saying they were doing. So on one side, you have while the Roosevelt administration is saying, we're neutral to anyone who will listen. We're going to go speech after speech every night about how neutral we are. At the same time, there's this group at Treasury who's saying, yeah, secretly what we're going to do is we're going to wage war against the Nazis. And we're going to do it because the Nazis are evil. And this is the right thing to do. And the war is going to come to our doorstep one day, whether we like it or not. This is going to be our problem. And we're not just going to sit here and watch it happen. We're going to take the fight to them, and we're not soldiers. We're not spies. We're economists, and so we're going to kind of invent this concept of economic warfare and try and kind of kick the legs out from underneath the German economy. At the same time that this team at Treasury is doing that, there was another team at the State Department on the other side, which is to say that there was a team of, at best, fascist sympathizers in the State Department. At worst, I would say out and out Nazis. I mean, the State Department was kind of rife with people who were openly supporting the Germans and the Italians against not just the British and French, but against the Americans. And so you had another deep state operation at state, sort of saying, no, we're not neutral because we should be joining the Nazis. We should be on their side. And we're not just going to kind of we're going to do whatever we can to kick the legs out from any kind of pro-British or pro-French operation that the Roosevelt administration is doing. Because eventually the Roosevelt administration is going to wake up one day and realize that, like, we should be on the side of the Axis. That's the right side to be on here. So in a way you find it's like multiple deep states, right? You have sort of multiple competing forces within the government with mutually exclusive and incompatible goals. You have a government very much at war with itself. And I might argue that's not a flaw, it's a feature. I think that the government's big. The American government's really big. Even in 1939, the American government is really big. And there's a reason we have human beings in those jobs, and it's because they're making moral decisions, they're making ethical decisions. And this is certainly a period where you had a bunch of people working for the government who were saying, we don't care what our sort of official policy is, we're just going to do what we believe is the right thing. And I guess the ethically complicated thing is you look back on this and say, okay, in the book, our guys at Treasury who were doing this are the heroes because they were doing it on the right side. The guys at State Department are the villains of the book because they were doing it on what I think we can inarguably say was the wrong side. But they were both making the same calculation, which is the government's policy is wrong. So we're just going to pursue what we think is the right thing to do one way or another. And, to hell with the consequences. Would they be the first or the last government bureaucrats to ever do such a thing? Obviously not. And it's funny. It's like, in some ways, do we only have the ability to evaluate the morality of that post facto? Like, who does it turn out was on the right side of that dispute? In this case, it was the Treasury Department. And I mean, the State Department's behavior was, a lot has been written about this, but it's like worse than horrible.
If you're being burdened by a bunch of high interest debt, you are going to want to do something to mitigate that. With an impending presidential election and financial uncertainty causing stress for just about everybody, you have to have a strategy to weather this period. So if it gets to the point where you're struggling, you should consider your options like refinancing your home with American Financing, where you can close your loan in as little as 10 days. On average, American Financing customers save $854 per month, the equivalent to receiving a $10,000 annual raise, which is real money you can invest to build your wealth and reach your financial goals, or just get out from under the struggle. This is an opportunity to regain control of your finances, and it costs absolutely nothing to see how much American Financing can save you. Just call 800-852-2010. Again, that's 800-852-2010, or go to americanfinancing.net/impact. If you know me, you know I am obsessed with optimizing my sleep. I go to bed at 9 p.m. every night and let my body wake up naturally, so no alarms. I am always looking for ways to improve my sleep quality, and that's why I'm excited about 8 Sleep's Pod 4 Ultra. This isn't just any sleep tech. It cools, heats, and even elevates automatically. It's clinically proven to give you up to 1 more hour of quality sleep every night, and getting as much sleep as humanly possible is the way to cognitively optimize. Now, my wife Lisa and I are temperature opposites, so we're excited about the Pod 4 Ultra's personalized heating and cooling features. Head to 8sleep.com/impact and use code IMPACT to get $350 off your Pod 4 Ultra. They currently ship to the US, Canada, the UK, Europe, and Australia. Okay, so let's start teasing some of these ideas out as guiding principles. So I think a lot of times people will argue a concept at what I call the level of the T. My audience will be very familiar with the story. So the biggest fight my wife and I ever got in was over a cup of tea. 2 hours into a screaming match, I finally go, there's no way this is about a cup of tea. What is this really about? So we vowed never to argue about the tea again. And so what we found is that you're really arguing about beliefs or values, or you might have what I call as a collision of base assumptions, where you just both have a belief about the way the world works that is completely different. And unless you lay those out, you're going to just argue past each other. So taking this argument to the level of values, I think will be very interesting. So for instance, do you think it is morally just to lie to the American people to get a desired global economic outcome?
This is a question for, so in many ways, it's a great question. This is why I like historical fiction. I mean, we sort of talk about this. Why am I writing novels about this and not nonfiction? And it's because I want to be able to tease out exactly the moral question you're asking from the perspective of from the inner lives, the inner thoughts of the actual human beings in actual history who are facing these very questions, because they're not simple ones. I think the answer is yes, of course it's the right thing to do. It helps that in the specific cases of government officials lying to pursue the outcomes they wanted, economic or military, in this book, it sure helps that they were on the right side. It sure helps that when Roosevelt himself, much less the rest of his administration, was saying, we're neutral, we're neutral, we're neutral, did Roosevelt know what the people in his Treasury Department were doing? Not exactly, but I think we have good evidence that, and the book sort of gets into this, that, they were the people at Treasury were basically sent Henry Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary, who was the president's dear friend, to his office to sort of say to Roosevelt, hey, look, I know we're neutral, but I've got some guys back at the office. They're going to do some stuff. Maybe you don't want to hear about that stuff. And, Roosevelt basically put his hands over his ears and said, nah, 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 I'm not listening. You didn't say that. Don't. As long as it never shows up in the newspaper, I never need to hear about it again. And you guys do what you need to do to get the job done. Was he lying to the American people when he then claimed that the United States was perfectly neutral in this matter of European dispute? Yeah, absolutely. He was lying to the American people when he said that. Was it the right thing to do? It sure helps that the Nazis were the worst, right? That I think we can all agree. It helps that you and I can both sit here today, and without making a ton of assumptions, I think I can say that we were both in perfect agreement that he was on the right side of that dispute, right? That these lies were being told for just outcomes. Defeating the Nazis was a just outcome that we can all look back and certainly support. And if it takes a couple of lies to do that, okay. If, look, then the moral question becomes, all right, so then where do you draw that bright line? Because anyone who's ever lied to anyone ever can say, no, but I was doing it for the greater good. You don't understand. I had to lie because it was in your best interest to be lied to after the fact. You can lie to your family, you can lie to your coworkers, you can lie to anyone and say, no, I was just protecting you from the worst, or I was doing it because if you believed this, then you would do something that made this all work out for the better of us. So I think that's, in some ways, this is a moral question. This is a Shakespearean question, right? More than an economic question. This is a kind of, what do we believe as people in the world about what are the ethics that guide our behavior towards each other? What sort of little white lies are acceptable? Where is that line crossed? Can we only, do we want to be perfect, effective altruists or perfect utilitarians and believe that only outcomes matter? It doesn't matter how you get there. The only thing that matters is the effect of your actions. Or do we want to believe, frankly, in a more Christian morality where we're saying, no, intentions matter. It matters what I was trying to do. And if I know that I'm lying to you, that's bad one way or another. So I think in these cases, in the cases that The Wealth of Shadows gets into, these characters were right to lie. But that's really easy for me to say because it worked. And if it hadn't worked, or if we were looking back and saying, oh no, it turned out they were on the wrong side, is that more it doesn't work out quite so well, does it? And in this book we get into the case of a character who is a real person who, as you were just saying, was effectively applying that same logic to justify being a Soviet spy, which he was. At the same time that he was sort of lying to the American people on behalf of the Treasury Department to defeat the Nazis, he was also lying to the Treasury Department on behalf of the Soviets, because he believed correctly that the Soviets were valuable allies against the Nazis for the United States, and the Roosevelt administration was holding them too much at arm's length. These were Operation 1, from his perspective, was defeat the Nazis. Let's work ever more closely with the Soviets to do that, and we can deal with that. We can deal with an American-Soviet problems later. But so you can kind of see within the book that the logic of, no, it's okay, I'm just going to lie to the people around me this one time because it's in the best interest for everyone. If you're making that sort of utilitarian argument that what matters is ends and not means, you better be really sure about what those ends are going to be.
Yes. And the thing that worries me is that no one is ever going to be sure that they're on the right side of history. And the wonderful thing about setting your book at World War II is not only is it a fascinating time period, but there's moral clarity, I would say, and you don't have to do a lot of calculus to be like, hey, the people killing people by the millions in concentration camps, they're the bad guys. But this begs so many questions about how you should approach something like this. So what I want to drill into is okay, if we know that we're putting a moral question on the table about whether you should be lying to people, if this is a Judeo-Christian ethic of like intentions matter, and so lying in and of itself is a problem, whether this is purely utilitarian, no, as long as we get to the end of stopping Nazis and saving lives, we're good and we can do anything we want, including drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like that's fine because, you know, we ended up saving so many lives by doing that. Okay, the question becomes, who gets to run that moral calculus? Ought it be done by vote, by decree? What's the right answer there? And then who gets to decide what lies to tell?
I mean, certainly when you're talking about a government, as discussed, the government's really big, right? And I think people make the argument, right? There's a reason we don't live in a perfectly representative democracy, right? We elect leaders. They appoint lots of people. Most of the government is appointed, not elected. They are in theory appointed by the people who are elected, and they're going to make many thousands of decisions, tens of thousands of decisions, hundreds of thousands of decisions every day that affect your life and that affect my life. And they're not going to explain themselves to us as they make all those decisions every single day. Some of those decisions will be relatively minor. Some of those decisions are going to be dropping nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we understand that for the government to work, it's functionally impossible for them to reach out to polling and say, hey, should we drop a nuclear weapon on this city at the tail end of a war? They can't ask that question, right? So on some level, what I would argue that elections are is making decisions about the people whose thought processes and judgment and character and is this someone, when you're voting for someone, you're saying, is this someone I trust to make it as a bunch of decisions that I'm never going to know about? Because it's certainly the case that I think that anyone in government will say this, that half of the important decisions are the decisions that we as citizens don't know about. And you and I see this in our own lives, right? Even taking this out of the context of government, like you make things, I make things. Half of, 3/4 of the really important decisions that go into how to make the things that we make aren't necessarily things that the audience is going to know about or hear about. They're not there for that decision making, right? They're on the outside of it, and they just see the outcome. And they weren't there for all the meetings that kind of went into that process, right? And that's certainly the case with government. So I think it's, I mean, the United States famously saw this with George W. Bush, right, who ran on a platform of non-intervention. Was sort of a big campaign plank for him was non-intervention in foreign affairs, and we're not going to be sort of policemen of the world, I think he said in a speech at one point. And then, sure enough, what was the sort of defining decision of the George W. Bush administration was the invasion of Iraq. The exact opposite of the very thing he had campaigned on. Now, one could make the argument that, well, what happened is the world changed and September 11th happened, and he was responding to new information and new events as it was coming in. And I'm not sitting here trying to defend the invasion of Iraq because I won't. But what we find there is that so that's a presidential administration in which what I think anyone would argue is in which the most significant decision that was made was quite public and was totally contrary to what the election had been about. It was something had happened, and the George W. Bush administration collectively made a set of decisions about what to do, and that set of decisions involves invading Iraq, right? And so I think when you're talking about what we want the government to do, what do we want how honest with us do we want the government to be? How much do we want the government to sort of stick to their campaign promises, or elected officials to stick to their campaign promises, or if you're asking kind of what elections are really about, in some ways, there's this kind of base lizard brain level on which elections are about electing people who we think have a good sense of judgment to respond in productive ways to unpredictable events as they occur.
It's interesting. So I don't know that that you can run a government without lying. I don't know. But the reality is, if you believe that the government ought to be elected officials by an informed republic, then you have to inform the public. Like, they have to actually understand the things that are going on. And if you're creating a smokescreen, which is what we're doing now, there is the world that we all think we interact with. And literally until I was in my 40s, I thought the world as I saw it was the world. And then the more that I began to learn about money, the more I realized, wait a second, the world that I thought actually isn't real, and that there is a curtain. Money is a fiction. It's being manipulated. It's being manipulated to my disadvantage. That we're being told one thing, weapons of mass destruction, just to stick on Bush for a second. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We have to invade Iraq. And I remember at the time being like, wait, what does Iraq have to do with 9/11? Like, I was like, well, I guess I just don't understand. And they just kept saying weapons of mass destruction over and over and over. And so I was like, oh, okay. And so you begin to realize, oh, what this is they are counting on the fact that the public is uninformed. They are counting on the fact that the public is manipulatable. They are counting on the fact that they have superior morals to what the public would have if they could vote in real time. Because if you, in the very near future, between just the way that everybody has access to a computer, the way that the blockchain works, you could, with every decision in real time, say, hey, everybody, grab your cell phone at home. You're going to be prompted to vote on 7 new things. Just send in your vote and we'll do it by decree. Now, I would say that that is a disaster. And the reason that that isn't going to function is because you've got a media that is just manipulating the living shit out of everybody. And we're being lied to left, right, and center. And so even though, yes, you could vote in real time, you would have to clean up all the BS first. And so if there was just, you would have to commit to complete and utter transparency and let the chips fall where they may if you really wanted to do a non-representative democracy, which I recognize for the people screaming in the comments right now. I understand that's not what we have now, but I'm just saying, for people who will put that forth, as you did and said we could never do this, technically it will be very feasible, I believe, in very short order to have everybody just vote immediately. Now, for all the ways that can be hacked and manipulated, it's probably beyond a terrible idea. But the question becomes, what would have to be true in order for us to want a non-representative democracy where everybody just casts their vote? And I don't know that humans are capable of digesting the issue, putting it out in a way that is accurately representative of what's going on. And not only do I not even know if that's possible, right now, it's just a bunch of lies. And so the question becomes, how do you create a functioning government when the mechanisms that have been proven over and over all throughout human history are that you lie to the public, you control the narrative? This is why whenever a dictator takes over, the first thing they do is take over the media. You lie to the public, control the narrative, get them to believe what you want them to believe. Many, many, many of them will. And then the dissenters, you just punish relentlessly.
This will be fun. Let me defend the status quo to you. Because I always feel like I'm such a boring...
As long as you define it first.
I'm happy to. It always feels like only boring people defend the status quo. So it's a fun exercise in some ways. Let's try and take this into the realm of something really specific. A specific question on which the government of, here in this case, I'll give an example of unelected officials making decisions that profoundly infect our lives without polling everyone first. Interest rates. You know a lot about monetary theory, so no secret that the board of the Federal Reserve, all these governors, make a set of decisions about what interest rates should be, right? These issues, where to set interest rates, is extremely technical. I know some things about economics. I am not a governor on the Federal Reserve Board, nor should I be. I don't have a degree in economics. I, Graham, want people who know a lot more about this than I do to be sitting on the Federal Reserve Board making these decisions. If you'd asked me a year ago whether interest rates should have been lowered more, I would have said yes, that seemed like the right thing to do. Now, in the middle of 2024, that turns out would have been the wrong decision. And that I would actually argue Jerome Powell and company have done a terrifically good job of managing the inflationary crisis of the past few years. And I'm not going to argue that the inflationary situation is perfect. I'm going to argue that it's better in the United States than it is in Europe, because I think Jerome Powell and company have done a better job than anyone in the EU has done. And I actually think it's pretty remarkable. So that situation, and we can have another conversation about whether we want governments to be managing currencies at all, but we certainly have a situation in which they are. So you can't poll a population about a question as complicated as where to set interest rates. People have lives. People are, it's a really technical, finicky question, right? And at the same time, someone needs to make a decision. There needs to be sort of, at the end of the day, one person in the government who is making that decision and stands up in front of a microphone at a podium and announces that decision. And then the world responds to it. So we don't know all of the considerations that go into that decision, right? We're not in the meetings where the Federal Reserve governors kind of discuss this, but we hear about the outcome. And I would argue that there's a specific example where, yes, the government is by nature keeping information from the public. It's keeping that decision-making process from the public. It's not consulting the public about that decision, but nor should it.
And nor should it, because the people are not going to be able to make that kind of well-informed decision.
Yeah, I'm not the most informed person about monetary theory in the United States of America, but I'm not the least. And had I made that decision a year ago, I would have been wrong.
Yeah, so this now gets into, are there some decisions that simply shouldn't be left to anybody to make the decision? So taking monetary policy. Monetary policy, I would put forth, there is a moral obligation that governments have to not manipulate currencies. The reason I believe that is because of my definition of money. My definition of money is that it is any one person's ability to capture the efficacy of how they spent their time. So if I spend my time as a school teacher, then I'm able to capture the economics of that, and the society values it to a certain degree, and I'm able to get that. Now, if the government can say, oh, well, we're going to print more money, now the economic activity that I was able to capture in the dollars that I generated by being a school teacher, they're now worth less. And so that will derange how I think about my money, because it's actually wiser to spend my money, hopefully on something that holds value. But no matter what, it is better to spend your money on the thing that it can buy today, because it will buy less tomorrow. And the fact that behind the scenes, we have unelected bureaucrats that are manipulating money that cause this downstream total derangement of people's relationship to their own time and energy. And so just to say it another way, by letting the government print money, you are letting them steal retroactively your own efforts. It's literally crazy to me. I cannot believe people are not more upset about this. They're not upset about it because they don't understand it. And so to your point, you have a thing where people, even if they have the time, like the amount of time I've spent to understand it and to feel like I'm sort of just clinging to the bottom rung of something, like you talk about in your book, John Maynard Keynes, who, as somebody who's in the Bitcoin community, I will say they fucking hate that guy with a fiery passion. And it's fascinating because reading your book, he basically describes what I want to do as a global currency. Literally, I'm waiting for you to say Bitcoin because it sounds exactly like Bitcoin. But he wants it to still be manipulatable. He wants people to have control. But ironically, by creating this high level currency that no one government had access to, he thought it would be less manipulatable. But he still thought the manipulation, in my reading of this, was a feature and not a bug, which is why they hate him.
I think that's correct. I think that is correct for... I think that is a correct description of his theories. He had this... It's funny, when you read biographies of Keynes, and I've I've read a bunch, they tend to skip over his what he called Bancor, which is his name for his kind of global currency he was going to create at the end of the Second World War. We tend to skip over this in Histories of Keynes because, as you may have noticed, he failed in his attempt to create Bancor. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist. A global currency was not created at the end of the Second World War. The Bretton Woods system, as we know it today, was instead the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. But yes, as you're saying, I think one of the interesting things to me about the conversations that Keynes and his colleagues and his enemies, frankly, were having around it, surrounding currency manipulation and currency creation in the Second World War, is that to me they felt, I was reading Keynes and I was reading his opponents writing in the 30s and 40s and going, oh my gosh, this could have been written yesterday. This is exactly the same set of conversations we're having about cryptocurrencies that we're having today. This is exactly the same set of conversations that we're having about, do we want governments to create currencies? Do we want someone else to create currencies? Who is the someone else? You just talked about currencies being manipulatable. I would argue that unless you want a fixed quantity of money forever, which I guess is the sort of Bitcoin argument, that that as soon as you move past that, all currencies they're by definition manipulatable. They were created to be manipulated. And so the question is just who we want to be manipulating it. Unless you're going to make an argument that we sort of want, a fixed pool, the kind of Bitcoin maximalist argument that we really want a sort of a fixed pool of currency that can't move up and down ever. You can make that argument, but if that was the case in 1939, the United States would not have been able to defeat the Germans. We would not have been able to...
With the economics, but the Germans also wouldn't have been able to manipulate their own currency to create that loop that allowed them to rearm.
That's true. Yes, they would not have been able to sort of do their own currency shenanigans and arm in that way, though they likely, these counterfactuals are always a little bit tricky, right? Describing sort of what would 1939 have been like with Bitcoin is a really tricky problem to solve, because on the one hand, you're like, well, but they didn't have computers. How would it work? There's a bunch of practical questions to solve. But if something like that did exist...
literally, you can look at it today, because what my hypothesis in reading your book is, your book is like talking about the Korean War during the Vietnam War. You do it to create a little bit of distance so we can really talk about the issues, but really, we're talking about Russia and Ukraine. Like, your book, as far as I can tell, man, whether you intended it or not, maps effectively one-to-one what's going on right now. We are manipulating the US dollar by printing a metric shit ton of it so that we can send aid to Ukraine without having to ask the American people if they're here for it or not. Because you just print, and it, in my words, steals from all of us because I don't have any say. You dilute my buying power, which is the same as taking some of my money, literally, effectively, is not different. If you inflate the currency, if inflation, because there is a difference between the amount that you inflate the money and the actual inflation felt in the marketplace for reasons that are fascinating, but we'll set aside. If inflation hits 20%, that's the same as taking 20% of my money.
That's right.
Just so people understand, like, hey, don't fall for the trick. So I'm not even saying it's the wrong answer to pay for the war in Ukraine. I am saying that it's the wrong answer to do it without going to the American people and saying, we would like to get into an economic war with Russia via Ukraine. Are you in or you out? And if they're like, we're out, then we're out. And that just is. And you have to accept, I'll finish that sentence and then I want to plant an idea. You have to accept that there is a wide spectrum of intellectual abilities. And so some of the voting public will not have the ability to cognitively understand the second and third order consequences of what's going on. They will be easily manipulated by messaging, which will be, whether people intend it to or not, be tilted in a given direction. That just is what it is. But hey, welcome to the human condition. I don't see a way around that. So if, given the populace speaking up, this is a very Western perspective, I believe in the power of the individual way over the power of the collective. And if those collective individuals come together and say, this is what we want, then that is what it is. And I don't believe, morally speaking, that anybody from the top should be able to say, no, I'm going to lie to you. I'm just not going to ask. I'm going to money print so I don't have to talk to you. And so that was the vibe that I got reading the book, man. And I kept wondering, like, are you intending me to read it this way? Because you convinced me that the deep state is real. You convinced me that my own government is at war with itself, that there are people in my own government that are like, I don't give a fuck what the public thinks. I am going to go to fight on the side of the Ukraine or God. I'm sure there are people like, I'm going to go fight on the side of Russia.
I'm sure there are, yeah.
1,000%. And so now I'm like, whoa, okay, here's the seed that I wanted to plant. There are solutions that come at a hyper oblique angle. There's a guy named Balaji Srinivasan. Mm-hmm. You know him?
Not personally, but I know of him. I've read his
brother,
work.
I think you'd find him utterly fascinating.
I do.
So his whole thing about the network state, and he's like, these governments, super passe, not going to work to a highly educated public. Once you divorce money from governments, you're going to find that people no longer group by region, they group by values. And while I'm not sure that plays out at that level, I certainly think that people do group by values, whether they group at nation state-esque levels, I don't know.
Ooh, a lot to respond to there. On the Bilyeu topic, I think his argument is fascinating and super smart. I almost entirely disagree with it, but I think there's really interesting things.
Give me a quick rundown of what you see his stance as.
Oh, great question. Whew. You just did such a great summary of it. I think the argument, so he's arguing, I take his argument, he argues a lot of different, very complicated things, but one of his arguments is against government-created currencies entirely, that this is a passe, as you just said, these are passe institutions, they don't work, they're too manipulatable, and that we sort of want, he's arguing against that human communities are best formed effectively electronically, kind of not based on physical location, but we'll be getting sort of networks of people, groups of people building effectively their own kind of delocalized, dephysicalized nation states. People can build their own currencies, people can build their own kind of communities, their own jobs, their own corporations, what have you. It's a sort of the nation state is going away to be replaced by these other communities. Do you think is that a reasonable description of what he's doing? You're probably better up on Bilyeu's work than I am.
Yeah, I think that's very close. The concept of strip governments of the ability to overlord on people by taking their money away, essentially their ability to manipulate the currency, and then don't lock them in with your borders and then see what happens.
So that's a great way of describing it. Because I'm actually largely in agreement with him on the open borders question. I'm like, my politics tend to be quite open borders, as are his from my understanding of it. The bit where I disagree with that is that the age-old argument that the government is the entity with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, a very classic kind of argument for that's what a government is. They're the people allowed to hurt other people, and we say it's okay. That's the definition of a government. That's either, gosh, your listeners who are more versed in Enlightenment philosophers recently than I am will remind me if that's Rousseau or Locke or Hume. I'm forgetting. I'm so embarrassed in this moment.
Drop it in the comments.
Yeah,
everybody.
drop in the comments who that was. But that's the idea is that that's the definition of the government, right? We say, what is a government? The government is whatever we say is allowed to put people in prison. The government is whatever we say they're allowed to have weapons that you and I aren't allowed to have. They're allowed to use force that you and I are not allowed to use. That's what defines a government. And I think that's correct. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we want the government to have access to nuclear weapons, but not for me and you sitting here to have access to nuclear weapons.
I was going to show you mine after the interview. Fuck.
Much as I think that my personal use of nuclear weapons would be entirely benevolent and right, and I would only use it.
Don't we all?
Yeah, for the right reasons and against the wrong people. I think that it is a good thing. I think it is a good thing that not only do only governments around the world have nuclear weapons, but only some governments have nuclear weapons. I think it's a good thing that the government of Iran does not have nuclear weapons yet. I think it's a good thing that we're trying to, I think the situation in Russia and Ukraine would look a lot different if Russia did not have nuclear weapons today, right? I think that's inarguable.
What do you think about the Second Amendment, right to bear arms?
Ooh, great question. So this is one of those things where I'm a little bit agnostic. Like, it seems, I feel like I keep reading about this. This is totally tangential, obviously, to Wealth of Shadows or anything. Gosh, it's complicated. So I feel like I keep, I'm from Chicago, grew up there, spent the first 18 years of my life there. And so Chicago, right, is famously a place with some of the strictest gun laws in America, and also sort of one of the highest rates of gun crime in America. And when you do, my loose understanding of the data on this is that when you do cross-state comparisons, states with stronger gun laws do not have lower rates of gun crime than states with looser gun laws. You can tell me if you've seen data that contradicts that, but that's my loose understanding of the situation.
I have no sense of the data. I'm a junior constitutionalist in that if I knew the Constitution better, I might make that statement really aggressively, but I know well enough to be like, if that's what we're founded on, then that's where we should be. And given the Second Amendment's pretty clear. Now, on the nuclear armament side, yes, I'm with you. And so if that ends up being a violation of the Constitution, I'm here for limiting nuclear weapons, yes.
So yeah, I guess in some level, right, we're just arguing, at some level, it's funny, I get really, perhaps because I write prose for a living, I find constitutional arguments impossibly tedious.
At a technical level or at a philosophical, moral level?
Both. And here's why. Because every time we have conversations about, this, depending on how you read this clause on this piece of paper from a couple hundred years ago, like, one set of people reads those couple words this way. Another set of people reads those couple words another way. I write prose fiction for a living, so trust me, I write books where hopefully different readers do take away different things from the text. This is a book where, as we were just discussing, I just wrote a novel, which is not a constitution, but at the same point, you'll have, you were talking about the book's comparisons to the way the book is kind of clearly making references to modern debates about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And I've had people write to me since the book is coming out saying, oh gosh, I like the book, but God, you were so pro Bitcoin. Like, this was, I couldn't handle how pro Bitcoin the book was. And I've had other people write to me and say, gosh, I really love the book, but this book was so anti-Bitcoin. Like, you really took such a strong anti-Bitcoin position. And I just disagree with you. And I don't understand. And that's, I would argue that's a feature, not a bug of what novels and art are supposed to do. They're supposed to raise these questions and not give anyone exactly what they're looking for. If you go into the book with one set of opinions, you should have those opinions challenged. If you go into the book with a completely contradictory set of opinions, you should have those opinions challenged. With constitutional arguments, it ends up being this thing. It's like, it vaguely feels to me like I'm listening to my English professor friends debate some monologue in the middle of Hamlet going, oh, I think Hamlet felt this way. And someone else is saying, I think Hamlet felt that way. And on some level, perhaps this is what I find tedious, is that I find myself going, well, do we have data on which version of this kills the fewest number of people? Because I feel like I'm in favor of the one that kills the fewest number of people. And this is perhaps where I'm maybe this is where I'm more of a utilitarian than I realize, where it's just the outcome matters more to me than some of the constitutional procedural arguments. And I think, like, in some ways, I almost feel like argument about the Second Amendment per se is a slight tangent to the actual issue. I mean, maybe it's because I didn't grow up with guns. I never had guns around.
Well, what I'm trying to peg it to, so in all these questions, I'm trying to map the way that you view the world so that I can understand, the reason to understand things is so that you can make predictions. And so I think of every human that I encounter as an incredibly expensive flesh-based AI that they may draw better conclusions than I do. And if I can map their thinking and predict their answers, then I now have access to that AI, even when they're not around me. So I'm always trying to understand somebody's thoughts and then go, okay, well, their way of thinking is going to lead to, this second, third, fourth order consequence, at least as far as I can think. really fascinating when I'm talking to somebody who looks backwards to form their, certainly is looking backwards to understand. Now, I won't put words in your mouth in terms of why you do that, but when I read your material, I look backwards to understand the future. So I read The Wealth of Shadows so I can understand Russia, Ukraine. And if I can then look backwards, understand the historical context of somebody like you, whose AI is really programmed on historical events that are knowable, it gets very interesting because I'm like, oh, he believes that for this reason. We see that play out historically. Did that play out well or not? So for instance, as we've been talking, though I haven't wanted to interrupt, basically every war that I can think of, and I'm not a historian, I want to be very careful about that. So I have a headline reader's sense of what I'm about to say. But every war that I think about post-World War II has not turned out to be what I will call a just war. And so all the things that we did to manipulate and win against the Nazis, we did to in the Vietnam, for instance. And don't love that one.
Disaster.
That did not go well. Afghanistan, Iraq, all of it. Like it just starts to get, this becomes a game that I start saying we just shouldn't be playing it. That the game unto itself is so manipulative and puts the power in the hands of unelected bureaucrats, although I really do think deep state is it conjures the right image, certainly in my mind, of these competing factions within a government that are pulling in different directions that may in fact believe another country is more moral, more just, more whatever. And so they're trying to pull in that direction. And I will even grant that they have the best of intentions, that they want the same things that I want, but they're going about trying to achieve them in a way that I'm mortified by. Again, reading your book brought that home to me in such an incredibly visceral way that in some ways, man, I'm really going to be able to draw a line in my thinking and say before The Wealth of Shadows and after. Absolutely fascinating.
That's so kind. I really appreciate you saying so.
Well, the question becomes, are you going to end up hating what I do with that thinking? That's what I'm trying to figure out in this episode is how do you think? So anyway, you're telling me things that you, for instance, the thing that made me ask about the Second Amendment was the government should have a monopoly on violence. And if Drew was really on his game, he would not have waited for people in the comments to tell us. He would have pulled that up. But whoever said it, that's very interesting. But now that for me brings up questions of, well, the founders of our Constitution said the thing you have to worry about is a tyrannical government, that we know there's something about the human condition that over time, a government entity is likely to bend towards tyranny. And while we think we've built one that'll keep itself in check, it probably still bends towards tyranny. And so the first thing we're going to do is say, nobody can tell you what you can and can't say. Okay? First Amendment, baby, freedom of speech. But that value is falling out of favor, which brings us back to my whole thing about its values are all that really matter. The second one is, and just in case they try to tell you what you can't say, you've got guns to protect them if they were shutting you up so that they could come do something else crazy. Now, I love the modern world, man. And I like that water just shows up at my house. And I don't want anybody to get confused. Life, despite the complexities of the moment that we're living in, is still awesome. And within the just proximity of people that can hear my voice in this room, let alone on this microphone, are people that I love. Things are great. And if you lose sight of that, woo-wee. What I think people are struggling with, and this is certainly true for me, I can feel the value system is changing. So anyway, what I want to map in this is your values, how they play out. And then as I get a better understanding of where you're coming from, we can talk about second and third order consequences. All right. That was all explanation as to why I asked about the Second Amendment. It's not tangential for me. It's all part of me trying to map how you view this.
Yeah. Wow. There was a lot to respond to there. I think that's fascinating. And yes, important to remember. I feel like we see charts in this all the time, that every time someone sort of starts tearing their hair out about this being, I don't know, the worst time to live in human history or something, you kind of go, well, actually, the fewest number of people globally are living at the poverty line since recorded time. Like fewer people are living under starvation, or a smaller percentage of the world population is living under starvation conditions now than has lived at any other point in human history. That feels pretty good. even beyond the fact that you and I can sit here in your beautiful home, surrounded by expert craftspeople building these things, surrounded by all this wonderful technology, the world, starvation is going down. War is actually, the rate of deaths due to war is going down over the last 100 years, 200 years, certainly 500 years, certainly 1,000 years, right? The trend lines, if you zoom out long enough, and you don't even have to zoom out that far, the trend lines are all going in the right direction. So that's great. When you say that values are changing, can you tell me more about what you mean by that?
Every generation is going to get the world that they want. And this is
that sounds
fascinating
like a Greek curse, like an ancient, be careful what you wish for.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so. This is why also history rhymes, is that there's only so many human personalities, which means all right, there's only so many personalities. What do I mean by that? Think of humans as flesh-based AI, like we were talking about previously. It's a very constrained system with a ton of epigenetic context. So you're born into an area where you have 50% of you is hardwired. There's nothing you can do to change it. And then there are a bunch of epigenetic tags on you so that if your family went through a famine, you're going to respond to calories in a wildly different way. If your family was hyper stressed out, it's mother way more importantly, but it actually tracks on both sides. But if your mother was hyper stressed out, especially during pregnancy, there are going to be all kinds of epigenetic tags on your DNA that have to do with just what she went through. So you're up against all that in terms of how you're going to respond to your inputs. Now, humans are the ultimate adaptation machine. So we are going to adapt to whatever environment we're born into. So that could be geographic. What's the weather like? What's the food like? How much exposure to sun do you have? Et cetera, et cetera. And then it could also be social. So, hey, you come out in a time of war. How do you respond to that? You'll adapt. So that's the 50% of you that is malleable. And so in the 50% that's malleable, in goes value system. And so if you were about to grow up in China and have one set of values, but instead, the moment you're born, I bring you over to Afghanistan, you're going to grow up with a very different set of values. Or I bring you to America, you're going to grow up with a very different set of values. Doesn't matter. Everyone's going to absorb the values in which they are born. Now, you'll get iconoclasts, obviously, but you're going to absorb the values that you're born into. Now, those values, along with beliefs and biological context, but now you have the whole shebang. Mm-hmm. So your values, your beliefs, your biological context, they make up this thing I'll call frame of reference. Frame of reference is the distorted lens through which you view everything in the world. You mistake your frame of reference for objective truth. All right, since values is one of the three things that make up your entire sense of how you view the world, they play an unreasonably outsized role. And since they effectively govern your sense of what is moral, now it just, in terms of what people want to see reflected in the world, that's a question of values. And you will see the left and the right, long story about how they get set up from a biological standpoint. It's pretty interesting, but for now, just accept that they do. There's a biological reason why some lean left and some lean right. But all of that ultimately comes down to a value system. And so when you see them colliding, they are colliding over values. They often can't explain them because so much of this stuff is just subconscious. But if the values of the day are, hey, everybody should be treated equally and we want to see all people rise and be happy, then you're going to get that world. Whether people try to fight against it or not, take the 60s. People were just like, no, we fucking had enough of this. We're not going to live in a place where some people have some rights and other people based on the color of their skin. Do not, fuck that. That's ridiculous. Cool. Society got what it wanted, as it always will. Just as throughout history, people have been crushed down, suppressed, because the values of the day were like, but they're lesser people, obviously. And so because that was the value system of the day, slavery's fine. Yeah, no problem. Then that's what people did. And so you can get Nazi Germany, where it's like, hey, this is the values. Germany is not going to be kicked around anymore by these, other imperialistic dogs from Europe. We're going to rise up and we're going to take back what's ours and nobody's going to tell us what to do anymore. Cool. Hitler's able to sway the values of the country and then the ideas follow. And then once they buy into your values, you're going to drive them into war. But first, you have to change the narrative, which is ultimately changing the values, which is changing their frame of reference, which is how you get people to act. So whoever controls the values controls the world. This is why people say that politics is downstream of culture. What they mean is politics is downstream of the mechanism by which we manipulate people's beliefs and values. And that very much is culture. So once you understand that your morality is controlled by an invisible set of values, you understand the game of manipulating yourself or being manipulated by others. But that's what I mean. So culture just gets values. It comes across in the music, the movies, the TV shows, the way their parents raised them, and on and on.
That's really fascinating. And I love your description of values as being our own kind of blurry lens that we internally through which we internally are viewing the world. And we know it's blurry. And I think one of the interesting things, again, as someone who writes books and makes films, like the point of that is to hopefully sort of contribute to culture, right? Like you want people, I make things so that people will engage with them and so that people will hopefully feel that their moral framework is being challenged or their understanding of the Second World War is being challenged, right? You want some kind of, you want people to be, we're a better culture if people are constantly challenging their own values. Is this really what I believe, right? I think it's something I do a lot, right? Where you're saying, am I right? I've been saying, whatever about the Federal Reserve for a couple of years, but is that still right? Do I still believe that? Is that still right? Like giving ourselves the opportunity to be wrong, constantly challenging our own frameworks, constantly surrounding ourselves with people who will challenge our frameworks. I feel like and as you're saying, especially our frameworks of values is really important. I mean, I've never had, as you're saying, we hold our values pretty dearly, but there's nothing, it feels to me like such a valuable exercise to try and have them poked at by someone else, especially someone else who's thought very hard about their own value system, right? Especially if they, I don't know, believe in a God that you don't, or they believe in a kind of ethical framework for the world that you don't. I think that's, I guess I would make an argument that that's kind of the work of culture, is to sort of create a constantly destabilizing, kind of like workout for all of our frameworks of values.
When you look at everything that the government has historically done with money printing, manipulation, et cetera, do you see that as a path forward that we want to continue on? Or do you want to see something like a Bitcoin come into existence or a Bancor come into existence that's outside of any one nation state?
I think that government created and controlled currencies are an imperfect solution to the problem of how to organize human society, but a better solution than I've seen from, frankly, any other comers, including Bitcoin maximalists. It's funny, you're using the word manipulate to describe what governments do with currencies, and I think that's correct. I don't disagree with you. I guess I would just say that manipulate's a funny word because it sounds somehow nefarious. In the sentence I just said, I just used the word controlled, which now that I think about it also sounds vaguely nefarious, doesn't it? Create or alter might be other words we could use to describe what's going on. And create's an important one, because I would argue that the book sort of gets into this. I mean, there are these, part of what Keynes was looking into and part of what a lot of the characters...
Can you tell people who John Maynard Keynes was?
Sure. John Maynard Keynes was, I would argue, certainly the most influential economist of the 20th century, if not the most famous and influential intellectual of the 20th century. He was a British economist, though not by training. He had no real economic training because I think until John Maynard Keynes came around, frankly, he almost invented the field of economic training as we understand it today. He was, as I said, he was English, born into a very kind of upper crust, posh, old money English family, and sort of had all the hallmarks of that kind of upbringing. Time in the Foreign Service, and he became he got a teaching position at Oxford quite young. I want to say he was 24, 25. And in that time, he basically pioneered a lot of like what is now the field of economics. Like, remember before that, before Keynes, economics wasn't really a field. You go back to something like Adam Smith, who did not describe himself as an economist. He was a philosopher. It was just philosophy. And the word economy was in there, but that was just philosophy. Economics was not its own study yet. It took a little while until the sort of early 20th century for economics to be its own field of study. And Keynes is one of the people who made that the case. His biography is fascinating. He was a sort of, as you were saying, a kind of like mid-upper level, like government. He'd spent some time in the government. He was a bureaucrat, certainly. And I'm so glad. I feel like so much of this book is a defense of bureaucrats / the deep state, or at least showing how they can be useful. And Keynes certainly spent his time as a bureaucrat. But First World War breaks out, and he is basically asked by the government to manage the British economy through the First World War, which he did. And this is one of his unquestionable geniuses. He somehow managed the British economy during the First World War. And sitting here today, I don't think I, or maybe anyone else alive, could really explain how he did this. He somehow managed it so well that Britain left the First World War in better shape economically than she entered it, which, given the destruction on all sides in that war, is unfathomable to me. He was, at the end of the war, greeted as a national hero. And it says something, I think, a lot about British culture, certainly at the time, that an economist became a war hero at the end of the First World War. I mean, everyone was stunned by how well the country was doing. Then he goes to the Treaty of Versailles. He's there as part of the British delegation signing the Treaty of Versailles, where he quite famously and quite publicly quits in a huff, because he felt that the treaty that the British and the French and the Americans the peace treaty they were signing with the Germans was so punitive against the Germans for having, quote unquote, started the First World War, that Keynes felt that it was going to doom Germany to all of these debts, to generations of poverty that would end up producing the cultural and social conditions under which some sort of dictatorship might later emerge. Keynes, at the end, at Versailles, he quits Paris and leaves, and basically, with shocking and terrifying accuracy, predicts to the letter the next 20 years of German history, and says, if you guys do this, I mean, he doesn't, he's not calling out Hitler by name, but he basically predicts what's going to happen in the next 20 years of German politics, ending with, the rise of something that looks a lot like the Nazi Party. And he says, if you guys force the Germans to sign this deal, this is what's going to happen. And if that's what you're doing, then screw you all, I'm out, and quits in a big huff. And he writes it up into a pamphlet.
Do you remember his reasoning? Why did he think such a punitive thing would lead to a Hitler-esque character?
Because he felt that it would first of all, it was going to force the Germans into decades of crushing poverty. And he was certainly of the belief that if you force a population into decades of crushing poverty, they're going to choose political solutions to that poverty that are horrible. I think Keynes felt that countries that are doing really well economically don't veer towards dictatorship. That comes from crushing social catastrophe. And he felt that, that punishing the Germans it might feel really good to say, oh, you guys started the war, or sort of quote unquote started the war, and we're going to punish you, and you're the bad guys, and we're the good guys. And it feels so good to kind of punish the losers of the war, but you've now created all these social conditions in Germany where not only do you have widespread poverty, but the government has to spend so much of its resources towards just paying the British back, paying the French back, paying the Americans back, paying back all these war debts, that you're also going to get all this resentment. Germans are going to grow really resentful for devoting, I forget what the percentages are, but whatever significant percentage of its GDP is just going to get sort of sent out the door to their former enemies in the British, the French, and the Americans. And you want to get a bunch of people really, really angry, you tell them, oh, you don't get to have food this week because actually the government's spending all of its money sending it to London. That's going to get a lot of people really pissed at London. It's going to get a lot of people really pissed at the English. And it's also going to get, as it would turn out, a lot of people really, really pissed at the Jews who they believed were sort of controlling the global economy in some sort of insane conspiracy theory. And sure enough, a lot of people really did come to grow tremendously resentful in Germany about the rest of Europe, about the Americans, certainly about, Jews across the world. And so Keynes had predicted all of this, writes this paper. The paper's writes it in a sort of, he publishes this book. The book somehow becomes a bestseller all around the world. I mean, this was a time when John Maynard Keynes could be like the best-selling author of the year with this economic treatise about why the Treaty of Versailles was such a bad idea. But then he lives this fabulously glamorous life where he invests really early in the artistic careers of Pablo Picasso and Virginia Woolf. He buys these Picasso paintings really, really early before they were valuable. Virginia Woolf he knows and gives her a house to write her first novels. He has this great artistic taste. It's this very kind of classy old money sort of world that he's from. He makes untold fortunes actually on the currency markets, which now we would consider tremendously unethical because he was a former government, he was managing currency for the British government and then made a ton of money on the currency markets. In the 1920s, we did not, they did not have the same ethical rules that we would today. Jerome Powell could not go and sort of play the currency markets the way John Maynard Keynes did in the 1920s. That would be illegal.
Tell that to Congress.
But seemed to work out fine. He sort of had these untold fortunes. He made, so Keynes was, personally, he was gay for his entire life and quite openly gay with the folks around him. We find in his diaries, he kept these amazing diaries of all of his sort of sexual encounters. He kept these, they're really funny to look at. People can Google them. They look like Excel spreadsheets where he'd kind of check off the various characteristics of all of the men who he was kind of meeting and sleeping with, and many hundreds of them every year. It was Keynes was a dashing, wealthy man in an exciting period in British history. And again, this was the worst kept secret in London, was that Keynes was sort of an out and out homosexual, meeting men in parks and going home with them. He was really famous too. So it wasn't like this was a secret you could keep particularly well. But so he was gay his whole life until he then met a woman named Lydia Lopakova, who was at the time the prima ballerina in the Moscow Ballet, then engaged to a messy divorce from Igor Stravinsky. Somehow Keynes meets her, falls in love, begins his first heterosexual relationship. They get together. He steals her from Stravinsky. They get married, attempt this sort of what turns out to be this wonderful life together. They're together for decades afterwards, in what by all accounts seemingly was quite a happy heterosexual marriage. And you can imagine Keynes is the most famous intellectual alive at the time. Lydia Lopakova was the prima ballerina of the Moscow Ballet who just divorced one of the most famous composers in the world. They were it's like a Kanye, Kim Kardashian kind of marriage. It's sort of two of the most famous people in the world get engaged in this messy thing. And it was this level of sort of the glamour around Keynes is hard to convey today because we talk about him as being an economist and it all sounds kind of a bit dreary, but he was anything but dreary. And so Keynes was basically running when the Second World War breaks out, Keynes was basically running the kind of British economic operation. He wasn't officially at the Exchequer when the war broke out, but he was so powerful and important in Britain that they nobody did anything without kind of going to him and checking with him. And they ended up giving him an official government position at some point during the war. But I think at the beginning of the war, he didn't even have an official position. He was just kind of like, well, look, we're going into war. So clearly the person we need to ask is the most famous economist in 100 years, if not ever, John Maynard Keynes. And so he ran the British war operation. And so he was in some ways, he's in this book, he's sort of the antagonist, he's an antagonist of our Americans, our American heroes, because they're one of the big questions on the American side during the war was, how do we fund, the United States had to fund not just the American war operation, but the British and French war operations as well. And Keynes was in charge of the British side, and he very much felt that the Americans wanted Britain to pay for all of the weapons we were sending them, and Keynes felt that, well, wouldn't it be quite nice if you just gave us all these weapons and we didn't pay for them? Wouldn't that be a better solution for all involved? And that was his position through much of the war. So there's a lot of kind of economic wrangling around this fact that, in 39 and 40, the Germans had built up this massive war operation. The British military was some tiny fraction of the size of the German military. The French military was a tiny fraction of the size of the German military. The American military was an even tinier fraction of the size of the German military. The collective Allied forces were outmanned and outgunned in 39 and 40 in every conceivable way. And so what our folks at Treasury had to figure out how to do was do what the Germans had done over the last few years. How do we build up our own massive war operation and build it very, very quickly? And moreover, the British don't have a war operation. The French don't have a war operation. We need to, like physically, Britain doesn't have enough bullets to go to war. They didn't have bullets. We need to start making millions of bullets, and we need to start making, quickly they were making 3 million bullets a month. World War II took a lot of bullets, and someone had to make them, and someone had to pay for the making of them. And neither the UK or France were in a position to be able to make them. So the US basically became the armorers of the entire Allied war effort. And that took quite a bit of government expense. To one of our earlier topics of conversation, the way they financed the building of, the way they financed the creation of all those bullets was by printing quite a lot of money, because someone had to pay a bunch of guys in Detroit to build a bunch of factories that would then make all these bullets. And that took money printing.
Which means the guys in Detroit paid for their own making of the bullets along with everybody else.
Well, yes. Maybe this is where this becomes an interesting question of, you were talking earlier about your sort of understanding of, and I think the book gets into this too, that like, if we accept that money is essentially a fiction, like it's not real, right? There's nothing real about it. It's just this thing we use so that society can help function. We can define it however we want to. And I would argue actually that that's one of, you were just asking about Keynes, I would actually argue that that's one of his greatest insights. So we talk about Keynes. Keynes is talked about as being sort of an economist of the left, and I think that's true. But he's an economist of the left who is very much not in the shadow of Marx. He is no Marxist. He is no socialist. He is certainly no communist. And Keynes's big contributions to economic thought are largely around exactly what we're talking about, which is money printing in times of economic distress. That is, in times of economic slowdown, the government should print more money to hire more people to do more jobs, to work more jobs. So when we talk about, the U.S. response to the Great Depression and the idea of, okay, the government's just going to hire a bunch of people to build roads and dig ditches and do whatever, that's a very Keynesian approach to the problem. Frankly, what the Germans did in the 30s to build up their war operation and to build the Autobahn was a very Keynesian approach. That was all government funded.
Inflation is eating the value of the dollar alive, and that's why it is more important than ever to look for ways to cut costs while also boosting performance in your business. And one solution that's helped over 37,000 companies do just that is NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. It reduces IT costs and cuts the cost of maintaining multiple systems. You improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors, and giving you an edge over your competitors. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. So head over to netsuite.com/theory right now. Again, that's netsuite.com/theory. netsuite.com/theory. How often are you checking your credit score, afraid of identity theft or account breaches? We all use the internet every single day for important things like personal banking and remote work, so why not protect yourself with our sponsor, Aura? Aura is an all-in-one cybersecurity service that keeps you safe online. Aura identifies data brokers exposing your info and submits opt-out requests on your behalf. Aura also monitors your credit, tracks your passwords for data breaches, and secures your online activity with VPN and anti-malware protection. You can try Aura for free for 2 weeks by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. Really fast, I want to challenge an idea there, and I want to get your feedback. So I would say this is why people in the Bitcoin community absolutely despise Keynes, is that it is the very same thing that led Germany to have to do conquest after conquest, because when you're printing money, you're now, even though money is quote unquote a fiction, which I hear you, but there is this real concept of value, right? That I will give you a thing if I get a thing that I want that is of equal or greater value. And so just the easy way to do it is to create what we call currency. Now, when you print more of that, you are taking money from everybody that holds that currency. And part of the reason, like you need only think of it as it's counterfeiting that's approved for the government. So the government is allowed to counterfeit their own currency. But the question you have to ask then is, if they can print money, why don't they just print everybody $1 billion? And people will either get stuck on that and go, yeah, why don't they just print $1 billion? Or they will go, oh my God, even printing me $1 is that same problem, just smaller. And so now we're asking a question of, not does this destroy the stability of the economic system, but it's just a question of how fast. So I'm willing to destroy it because I hope that when it falls apart after me, or that we can sort of limp this thing along long enough. Or maybe they have a vision of, well, the currency in Great Britain, the sterling, they used to be the reserve currency, and look, they're fine now. And so, what's it matter that they used to be the most powerful economy in the world, and now they're, God knows where. So, people, I think, lose sight of that at their peril. So the fact that Keynes he doesn't want to go to, say, gold, which is way too restrictive. You can't manipulate it. I know you don't love that, but I stand by that choice of word. Because of that, you now get into the people that hate that because it is taking from everybody else in an invisible way with no vote.
Yes, I don't disagree with anything you just said. May I give you the Keynesian counter-argument to that? So, 2 things. One, and this isn't just Keynesian, but why does gold suck as a global reserve currency and a currency overall? Because the amount of gold in the world is not fixed. We keep finding new stores of gold all over the place. There is a lot more gold now in the world than there was 100 years ago. And gold is the worst of all possible options, because not only, at least with Bitcoin, you have the argument that, okay, there's a fixed store of these things. This is the number of Bitcoins that are ever going to exist. With gold, somebody finds a new mine somewhere. Someone finds some new store of gold, 100 miles below the earth, or a mile below the earth or something, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Oops, now the price of gold all over the world just fluctuated. And it fluctuated totally randomly. That's even worse than central planning, because you have fluctuations now depending on what some mine happens to do someday. So I would argue that gold as a currency manages to combine both the worst features of Bitcoin and the worst features of the US dollar. The Keynesian argument to the why don't we just print everybody $1 billion is, I think this is a really interesting point about Keynesian theory. And what he would say is, and I think this is his famous quote, I think I'm going to get this right. I'm always mangling these quotes, but I'm pretty sure this one's short enough that I can do it right. Anything we can actually do, we can afford. I would argue that single sentence is utterly central to Keynesian thought, and it's a thought that I agree with. I don't agree with everything about Keynesianism, but that's a bit that I will totally agree with. Which is to say that the reason we can't print everyone $1 billion is because everyone is not sort of doing $1 billion worth of work. That money is fiction. Money is all made up. It's just stuff we need to move around in order to sort of get real things to happen in the world. We can define it however we want. We can make it do whatever we want. We can make it work however we want. The thing that matters is what happens in the real world. If you want to make a bullet, the constraint, if we have the technology to make a bullet, we can make some bullets, and we can make as many dollars to go make bullets as we want to, because we have the technology to do that. We know how to do it. If we want to build a cold fusion machine, the government can print as many billions of dollars as it wants to build a cold fusion machine. It doesn't matter. We don't know how to do it. We're physically incapable of doing that. The thing that matters is the real world.
Meaning, if you put newly printed dollars, inflationary dollars, into cold fusion and it doesn't work, you just inflated the money supply.
Exactly.
But if you do it to create a bullet, which has an economic unit of value, you did not.
That is the argument. And so you can create money and have it not be inflationary to the degree that the real world corresponds to the money you're making. So where the actual work, actual productive use. And part of this has to do with kind of how we defined, like, what are actual goods in the actual world, right? Establishing that money is a fiction. You can't eat money. You can't, money doesn't keep you warm at night, right? The heat that goes into your house keeps you warm at night. The blanket that's over you is what keeps you warm at night. Money is sort of a tool that we use, and the way we kind of think of money now is something we use is a tool that we use to kind of move society in such a way that a lot of people can get blankets over them at night, or that more people can have blankets over them at night than had blankets before, because we know how to make blankets. We have the technology to make blankets. If the government, a Keynesian thought would be that if the government wanted to spend money making, I don't know, how many Americans are there now? 300 million, 400 million?
30 is the last official count, but we'll get back to your open border statement from earlier. So it
we'll do that, yeah. Great. So let's call it 330. If the government wanted to make 330 million blankets so that everyone in America could sleep with a blanket over the night, we absolutely have both the technology and the money creation ability to do that. We have factories that can make blankets. We have logistics systems to make blankets. I mean, logistics is a part of this too, right? What we can do that, and the argument is that would not be inflationary because that's creating real value for people. It's creating like real things that people can actually use in the world. If we can actually do it, we can afford it, and we can make the limits on how much money we can print are physical limits. Another great historian whose work went into this book a lot is David Graeber, who we should certainly talk about. Contra Keynes, David Graeber was, he just died a couple years ago, very sadly. He was a socialist. He was like an out and out, very proud socialist. But he wrote a wonderful book that I can't recommend more highly to your listeners called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. And it's a wonderful history of the concept of debt. And this shows up in my book, and I really just stole it from Graeber because I think it's so brilliant. He talks about the idea that effectively digital currencies predate physical currencies, that one of these questions that Keynes is looking into, and frankly other economic historians are looking into, is where does money come from? Where was money created? Who invented money? Where did we come up with this thing? Adam Smith tells this theory that we've all heard. Adam Smith sort of popularized a theory that became kind of how economists tend to talk about it now, which is always some kind of parable about, like, there's two farmers, and one of them has cows, and the other one has hay or something. And the guy who makes the hay wants to sell it to the cow guy, and the guy who has the cows wants to sell it to the hay guy, but they don't know how much hay, or how many cows is a barrel of hay worth, how many barrels of hay is a cow worth. If only we had some sort of system for figuring out what things are worth, and then I can exchange them. Like, actually giving you a cow is physically really difficult. So, gosh, if we had some little slips of paper we could use to sort of smooth over this transaction. And so money was created. Okay, that's a very standard Adam Smithian account of how money was created. An account that that Graeber, I think, sort of brought my attention to, it's usually called the chartalist theory of money creation, because it comes from another school of economic thought, is that this did not, that entire story is ridiculous. That didn't happen. That has never happened. And in fact, we've never found evidence of any human civilization, no matter how old, looking back however many thousands of years, we have never found any evidence of any human civilization that didn't have money. Money predates written language. Money predates... money's as old as belief in God, as like people staring into the stars and wondering what's out there. Money is as old as the human brain because, and they didn't use little pieces of paper, but they effectively had sort of rituals and processes and tablets around which people could make check marks to record debts, because money is debt. And we know that's kind of literally true, right? Like on a dollar, what makes a dollar? It's the part on it that says, if you bring it to the treasury, we'll give you this much in gold. And they don't actually do that anymore, but that's what it like says that on dollar bills, right? Like that's what the value of a dollar. A dollar is a debt. All dollars are debts from the US Treasury. Money is sort of literally this history of debt. And so the Graeberian argument that I find quite compelling is that the history of money is really a history of human society. And so we had money long before we were kind of moving pieces of paper around. And so we can't think about the questions of like what money is and what do we want it to do are, as you were just saying earlier, they're questions of values. If we know what we want to do as a society, we can determine how to make the money system sort of do that for us. If what we want to make is 3 million bullets, we can make a money system that makes us a lot of bullets. If what we want to make is blankets, we can make a money system that makes us a lot of blankets. If what we want to do is capture territory and kill a bunch of strangers and enslave a bunch of people, we can also make a money system that does that. And I would argue that the sort of Keynesian argument is also this one of, similar to what you're making, it's this argument about values. It's saying it's a better thing to do to design an economic system that makes lots of blankets than an economic system that makes a lot of bullets.
If I understood that well, I'll be able to sum it up in a single sentence, which is to map it to a law of physics. Value can be created, but it is only destroyed when you don't get a good of comparable value for the money that you created. This is probably better to say it in money. Money can be created, but it can only be destroyed if you fail to create a good of equal value. Meaning, if I've understood all that correct, and this is why I was saying earlier that inflation is a tricky beast, and that it doesn't map one-to-one, because if you create money and out of thin air, but you do it in such a way that it creates a good that people want. So you paid somebody with new, fake, counterfeited money, printed, however you want to think about it. If you pay them to make a bullet with that newly created money, as long as you get the bullet at the end, it was as if there was already a balance between the money and the thing. But if in the case of COVID, you just give people a bunch of money and there's no economic output, then you do destroy that value. And now you are back to what I was saying, which is that form of theft where you printed money, nothing of economic value came out the other end. And so now you have literally taken from everybody and spread that. You have, as they say, socialized the losses. Because we could get very complicated as to how the money gets into the system, which favors people that own assets, which then tends to favor the rich. And this is how you accelerate the rich-poor divide, which is another reason that people that are against Keynes absolutely hate money printing. But I can see the logic, even though I think it is a system that becomes so dangerous, because you will, some very distressing amount of time, put money into the system without creating something of economic value, and therefore it takes.
I think that's wonderfully put, and I honestly, actually, I agree with all of that. Yes, you're going to make mistakes sometimes. You're going to print too much money sometimes. Like sometimes you're gonna overshoot, sometimes you're gonna undershoot, right? You're always trying to gauge money printing to the amount of real world goods. And I actually liked a lot when you use the word value in your kind of Newtonian physics example, because I think value is a very good way of thinking about it. That, and another way of framing this might be to say that, here's why I think value is a good word to use here. Adam Smith would argue that there is no such thing as value. Adam Smith would argue that this cup is worth, the cup that I'm holding in my hand right now is worth exactly what I can convince you to pay for it. If I can convince you to give me $1 for it, it's worth $1. If I can convince you to give me $100 for it, it's worth $100. There is no inherent worth or inherent value to this cup. Keynes would say that's bullshit. It does have inherent value. The inherent value is that it brings, in this case, the last bits of cold coffee to my lips. Like, it does a thing. It physically does something, and that thing has value, and that thing has value to society. The money part that we use to sort of describe it, who cares? That's just the money bit. The value it has is real. So yes, when we talk about, which sounds a bit kind of airy and philosophical, but I think it has direct application to what you're describing about the kind of COVID era money printing that first the Trump administration and then the Biden administration did with the, I forget what they were called. There was two stimulus packages, right? The Trump era one and then the Biden era one. So I would, while neither were perfect, I would defend both and say that at the time they were 2020 and 2021, if I'm remembering this right, correct me if I'm getting the years wrong, I would make the argument that given what was the kind of societal cataclysm that was those couple COVID years, printing too much money, you'd rather err on the side of too much than too little. And they erred on the side of too much. And I would argue, boy, did they ever err on the side of printing too much. They printed a lot too much. I don't think anyone would make the argument in hindsight that they printed just the right amount. They obviously printed too much. Hence the rise in the rate of inflation that we're seeing today. And we're seeing it all across the board, right? Because, I mean, I think comparing it to Europe is a great example where, inflation is bad in the US, but compare it to Russian inflation. I mean, isn't it like 15%, 20%? It's terrible in Russia. Compare it to someone in your comments can look up the numbers. It's much, much worse. Or Drew can look it up. Compare it to the UK was worse. France was worse. Germany was worse. The US has done, I would argue, comparatively quite well in response to sort of comparable economies across the world.
Okay, I haven't looked at this, but I will say that because the US dollar is a world reserve currency, we're actually outsourcing a lot of our inflation, which is partly why we don't feel it as much at home.
Agree. I don't disagree with that. I will agree. Yeah. 100% agree with what you just said. But I would make the argument that if you're going back to 2020 and 2021, you'd want to, while ideally you would get the amount of money, you'd print the exact right number of dollars to precisely correspond to the amount of economic activity going in the world, you're looking at a period where there's widespread unemployment, right? Where people are stuck at home, people are not producing goods, they're not producing value into the real world. No one is making cups. No one is making, I write books for a living, and I remember this period in 2020 where I had my book before this came out at the beginning of 2020, and we physically ran out of books because the printing presses stopped. Like the factory where they print, I don't even know where the factory where they print these hardcovers is. I think it's in the Northeast somewhere. The factory was shut down, right? So there weren't any more books. That's a supply chain problem that had not been faced in the United States since I don't know when, if ever. I can write as many books as I want, but we physically lacked the ability to print them and send them to people. So there's all this value that's being lost. So we're kind of printing money to fill the gap. And as you were just saying, obviously that money people were paying rent. A lot of people used it to pay down debt, which is not super helpful. But people were not using that money to, build highways or print books or build cups. And so we got a lot of inflation. The argument the pro argument for that I would make is you want to better to err on the side of too much than too little, because erring on the side of too little means too little could mean widespread unemployment, the likes of which we've never seen in the United States since the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, and while the inflation in the United States is currently not ideal and bad, it's a lot better than Great Depression era unemployment.
Yeah, it is. Okay, this is where it starts getting complicated. So no one wants to see people without jobs. I changed the entire focus of impact theory of the show as my very small contribution to what I thought was going to happen, because I did not know what money printing was. And so I thought, okay, people need to buckle down. They need to know how to weather this storm. The problem is that while money printing worked and it did a very good job of making sure that all of us in 2020 did not suffer, it does create suffering for the next generation, for sure. Mm-hmm. And so we said, hey, we don't want to suffer, so we're going to leave you guys to suffer. And so what I want to know is, what do you think history tells us about the money printing that we're doing now and the national debt that we've racked up? Because when I put it in context of the wealth of shadows and what happened to Germany and how crazy their debt was and the madness that ensued because they were just so burdened with debt, and what we can learn from Great Britain and what happened to them because they were so burdened by debt, what does history tell us about this moment, money printing and our national debt?
It's a great question. So obviously during the Second World War, the United States printed a ton of money and racked up a ton of debt. And we did it to win a war that we felt, I would argue correctly, and I think we would all argue correctly, was existential. And sure enough, it worked. We won the war, as we all noticed. And we ended up building a bunch of factories to build bullets and build airplanes. You know, the airplane factories are still there, right? Like the Boeing factories are still there. They're still making airplanes. We ended up building up during the war. We used all the money printing and all of the debt, all the government bonds, to build a bunch of things that are kind of blue chip, valuable American industries. So I would again say that the issue isn't money printing itself. The issue is, what are you using the money for? The devil's in the details here. If you're using the money to build factories that can now produce airplanes that we can sell all around the world and people can use to fly places, there's value created there. If you're using the money to just sort of like go into the black hole that is the Wall Street financial system, I would argue that not that much value is being created there. So what does history teach us about money printing per se and debt per se? It's that they're not per se problems, but it depends on what you're doing with them. You know, I think now, let me give you an argument against what I'm just saying, which is, so the argument against what I just said is, okay, Graham, that's well and good, but we are not engaged in World War II right now. Like, yes, we're funding a Ukrainian war operation. Yes, we're making weapons for Ukraine, but you can remind me of however many billions of dollars, $80 billion, was that the last aid package to Ukraine?
The most recent, perhaps, yeah, but that's certainly not the sum total.
It's a couple $100 billion, something like that, total?
Gotta be.
Am I getting
don't know
it right?
the exact number, but it's, hundreds of billions.
Hundreds of billions. So, though that gets a little bit complicated, because most of those values are the value of weapons we've already built that are just sitting there that we're giving away rather than selling them. Or we're actually doing the same thing we did with the British in the Second World War, where we're saying, we're going to quote unquote sell it to you, but you don't have to give us any money now. We're going to give you a loan to pay us for it. So, and it's a little bit unclear exactly when these loans are going to be due. Like we did this in the Second World War with Britain, right? We funded their entire war operation by there's two programs. The first was called Cash and Carry. The second was called Lend Lease. And in a nutshell, the basic idea of these programs was saying to the British, we're just going to give you a bunch of weapons that you're quote unquote buying from us. But we're also going to loan you the money to buy them from us. So we're just paying ourselves the money to make these weapons. you're going to pay a small interest rate on those loans, and the loans aren't due for 50 years. And so sure enough, there was some funny moment. I want to say it was in 94 or 1996 when Britain finally paid back its World War II loans to the United States, like at the point where, frankly, due to inflation, the value of those loans was negligible. So they're kind of fake. It's a way of looking like we're kind of charging for the weapons without actually really charging anyone for the weapons. And in the Second World War, I would make the argument, and certainly Keynes made the argument, that this was the right thing to do because it was really, really important for U.S. security that Britain had a bunch of weapons to fight the Nazis, because certainly in 39 and 40, they were actually at war and the United States was not. So we could make a bunch of weapons, but the U.S. can't use them. We're not at war, but Britain was. Moreover, it was vitally important for U.S. national security interests that Nazi Germany not take over Britain. That would have been bad for America. So if a bunch of kind of fake loans is what that takes, great. A small price to pay, literally speaking. It's a little more complicated with the aid to Ukraine, because when we talk about these aid packages, some of it is direct financial aid, but if I'm remembering rightly, it's a lot of just giving the Ukrainians weaponry that's just sort of sitting there. And then like loans to quote unquote buy the weapons that they're never going to pay back, and no one is expecting them to pay back. And we know they're not paying it back. They know they're not paying it back. It's fine. But then, of course, we have to sort of use a bunch of money to rebuild the weapons, right? If we're giving them a bunch of bullets, in theory, we have to go make a bunch of bullets next year so that we can have some bullets around, because the U.S. military doesn't want to run out of bullets. So your question was about what these events in history teach us about this present moment. And I guess I would argue that what they would show is that neither money printing nor these huge debts are intrinsically bad if we're using them for the right thing and if we're using them to build productive capacity. Like the U.S. left the Second World War in much better shape economically than she entered it. I would argue that this isn't even my argument, this is a pretty commonly accepted argument, that the American economic success of the 1940s and 1950s through the 1960s was because of how well we did economically during the war. We shrank unemployment, we made all these jobs, we used government money to build all these factories, and then sure enough, those factories could produce cars and all sorts of stuff after the war that, created the life of America in the 1950s that we all sort of talk about today. So what you're actually doing with the money really matters. Now, I'm again going to argue against myself and say, okay, but U.S. national debt now is significantly higher than it was during World War II. And there was a war on then. So really, is this actually a sustainable level of debt? Obviously, it's a tricky question because it is, by definition, unprecedented. The U.S. government is in an unprecedented level of debt right now. The argument I would make is that people keep buying treasury bonds. So I know I was just talking shit about Adam Smith a minute ago, but if the value of something is what someone will pay for it, well, clearly the global markets seem to think that the treasury is good for the money. If people didn't buy T-bills, then we'd have a problem, but we don't seem to have a problem selling them. So, in theory, on some theoretical level, is the debt a problem? I suppose so, but in the real world, it's hard to find evidence of the actual problem.
Okay, so the evidence of the actual problem. Do you think that people will continue to buy them no matter what our debt to GDP I think is a good indicator? Not everybody agrees with that, but we'll use it for now. Do you think there is any number at which point the debt to GDP becomes so problematic that foreign institutions stop wanting to do transactions in dollars, for instance? They stop buying our bonds?
I think it's a great question. Again, this is sort of theoretically yes, but I'm hard-pressed to say what that number is because the global market for treasury bonds seems to have lost none of its appetite over the last decade, much less the last 50 years. I don't see any sign that anyone's sort of going, oh gosh, now that the debt to GDP ratio hit whatever it's at right now, I'm going to buy. I don't see a real world actor buying fewer treasury bonds as a result of that.
Well, so that may just be that you've missed some of the headlines. So China is going hard in the paint to divest themselves of U.S. bonds. They are getting out of the U.S. dollar game. They have teamed up with the BRICS nations, which I'm pretty sure I've seen you write about. So you've got...
But isn't that because of their own currency game? I mean, yes, so I'm interrupting you, sorry.
No, none at all, please.
Well, no, I was just going to say that isn't that their own, I mean, that the Chinese government is facing their own massive currency problem. Their COVID era inflation, it's really hard to tell because all their government statistics are lies, but from what we can tell...
Governments lie? Graham Moore, it can't be true.
This is great. I've convinced you that bureaucrats are good, and you've convinced me that governments lie.
Oh, you have not convinced me that bureaucrats are good. You've convinced me that our government is full of people that have their own agenda and they are pulling in different fucking directions. You convinced me of something very scary, very scary. In fact, yeah, we'll get. I have one question about that we'll get to later. But first, China.
Yeah, China.
Give me your take.
Always, oh gosh, I'm so far from a China expert. And again, every time I try to look at this, I feel like it's really hard because it's no
But you don't have
secret.
to look beyond Bretton Woods, as far as I'm concerned, to tell me, which you write about in the book, utterly fascinating. You prompted me to do a ton of research about this. But Bretton Woods, I think, predicts BRICS and explains exactly what is going to happen. And so the only question is, in Bretton Woods, which country is America now? Is America still America?
Or are we Great Britain?
Or are we Great Britain? Are we... India, we're going to be somebody else's pawn? Are we the Soviet Union? And we're just going to hey, we're not going to let any of you control us. We're out. What do you think this moment represents for us if I'm getting the numbers right, the debt that was crushing Germany so bad they turned to the Nazi war machine was in today's dollars, $1 trillion. That was the crushing debt. Can't see beyond it. Oh my God, country's terrible. $1 trillion. Guess what, everybody? We're $32 trillion in debt. So interest rates go up, servicing the debt becomes a problem. Already, if I'm not mistaken, we spend more in servicing our debt than we spend in military, keeping our military up. This is bigger than that. In 3 years or something, it will be our single biggest expense. And now I'm making it up, but it's something like in 4 years at the current rate of growth that simply servicing the interest on the debt will be more than we bring in taxes, full stop, all of it together, which means now your only way to service the debt is print, which is how you keep creating the problem.
Yes.
But because I say that as a framework for you to answer the question, who's America in the new sort of Bretton Woods?
A great question. And I think it is vitally important to U.S. economic interests and to U.S. national security that the United States do everything possible to make sure that the U.S. dollar remains the global reserve currency.
Do you think shutting off Russia moved us towards remaining the dominant reserve currency or away from?
Oh, good question. It probably hurt short term because Russia is doing far less of its trading in dollars. And it's going to push them towards renminbi or God knows what else. But the argument would be in the long term, it's better if the war kind of reaches a satisfactory conclusion. So a mixed bag. But I think it's no secret that the Russian government does not want the US dollar to be the global reserve currency anymore, nor is it any secret that the Chinese government does not want the US dollar to be the global reserve currency anymore. I don't think anyone thinks the Russian currency is about to be a global reserve currency. They've been largely cut off from the SWIFT interbank system. It's almost impossible to trade Russian currency around the world. Chinese currency is a different matter, and they're obviously doing everything possible to, buy oil in renminbi. They're doing everything possible to trade in Africa in renminbi to sort of get it used all around the world in the same way the United States was doing in the 1930s and 1940s and paid off very well for us. So I think winning that currency war is going to be tremendously valuable for the United States. And as you were just saying, the United States benefits in untold ways from the fact that when we print dollars, everyone else in the world has to deal with that. Like, because dollars are a global reserve currency, we're printing dollars that aren't just used here, but they're used everywhere. I think that's to the United States' benefit. So that's the other thing when we talk about the unprecedented nature of debt to GDP ratios. The other unprecedented bit is the degree to which not only is the debt to GDP ratio unprecedented, but so is the ubiquity of the US dollar in which that debt is denominated around the world. And the fact that our debt is denominated in dollars and not something else is both, I think from your perspective, it's scary because our debt is denominated in the currency that we control, we can just print more of it to pay back the debt, which terrifies you. I can see by the look on your face right now. From my perspective, it's okay. I would much rather have debt denominated in dollars than something the United States government cannot control.
Agreed. It's the only reason it's not crippling. Okay, so one thing that I would like to know is, do you think BRICS is a real threat, or is it it's so small we don't have to worry about it?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew more about the subject. From my loose understanding of this, I think it's a threat to be taken seriously. I mean, again, like the ubiquity of the US dollar is tremendously valuable for me and you and American citizens, and frankly, for kind of global stability. And so I think it's worth preserving that system. And I think how big of a threat is BRICS? I'm not an expert enough to, I don't know, like quantify the, I wish I could give you a 6% chance of disaster, 25% chance of disaster. I don't know what the percentage of chance of disaster is, but I know that there is a potential disaster.
Do you think I'm crazy to say it's 100% chance? I just don't know over what time period. It could be another 150 years, but the US dollar will lose reserve currency status. So tells me history.
Oh, that's an interesting argument. I mean, I've never thought about it that way. Let me try and think about that for a second. I mean, you have to be right? Because no currency has ever maintained global dominance forever. I mean, no empire lasts forever. Rome fell, the British Empire collapsed. Nothing lasts forever. We are, 80 years into this project of kind of a post-war American empire, with the US dollar being, and the sort of difference of what I would argue is the American post-war empire is that it's an empire of dollars. It's not an empire of soldiers. We don't have, kind of soldiers at outposts everywhere around the world. We are not, the United States has not for 80 years been on a path to conquest to take new territory. When was the last time the United States government took new territory? It's been a little while.
I don't know the answer to that is the only real question.
Yeah, the fact that we don't know is a good sign.
TikToking that one real fast here, or not TikTok, but in 1947, the Mariana Islands, Caroline Islands, and Marshall Islands became the most recent U.S. territorial acquisition as of August 2021. We certainly haven't taken any since then, so there you have it, 1947.
Yeah, so it does not seem like the United States is on a massive path of territorial conquest around the world, but the U.S. dollar has been. And that, I would argue, has been tremendously important for global stability. In a way, and that's a defense of the Bretton Woods system. That's saying that, at the end of the war, a bunch of people got together in a hotel in New Hampshire, in the town of Bretton Woods, to fashion an economic system that would prevent a third world war. And knock on this table right now, so far so good. I think, you can hear the trepidation in both your voice and my voice, because as we sit here in June of 2024, it feels like we're uncomfortably close to something that could tip into a war of global proportions, which we haven't seen in 80 years. And I think I don't feel comfortable putting words in your mouth, but I think I can safely say that both of us feel like that is a situation to be avoided.
Yeah, there's a great quote. Anybody that lives by the crystal ball is destined to eat glass. So 100%, I'm going to be wrong, that I know, but I think it is extremely worthwhile for people to build their internal logic and say, okay, based on the things that I believe, here's what I think will happen. And if you believe it enough, then you'll act accordingly. I mean, this comes back to the John Maynard Keynes thing, where he painted a picture of the next 20 years of Germany's existence, and he was right, because he actually understood the machinations. And I think that's really important. I posted a clip today from an interview I did with Ray Dalio, arguably one of the greatest economic minds, certainly made more money off of his economic beliefs than anybody living. That's got to be close.
Yeah.
Certainly in terms of hedge fund owners, there might be personal investors that have done better. But and he was saying, Tom, I was putting forth a thesis that we need a leader that can unite us. And he said, nope, you're making a mistake because that's how dictators come to power. Now, his whole thing was you're skipping past the mechanism of action. Now, I actually think in the final analysis, he's going to end up being wrong. And unfortunately, I did not push him and say, well, Ray, what's the mechanism of action in your world? And because what he'll tell you, I'm so familiar with this because I've asked him this question a dozen times, is it all comes down to how people are with each other. And so, yes, if people have high trust, if they're getting along well, if they're not, torn apart by division, then things go well. And for him, the mechanism of action of the everything falls apart is people have division, they start pulling away from each other, and there is no way to bring them back together. Okay, so I believe that we are all in the grips of ideas, and if you can put forth an idea of unity, that you actually can get people to come back together. So now whether I have a path that will trigger the right mechanisms of action is a very valid point, but I don't think it sort of violates any sort of laws of humanity that we can do that. But where I think we are, the mechanism of action that I'm trying to lay out is that money printing creates a mechanism of action that when you're the one that controls it, you end up racking up debt. Now, an interesting fact that I want everybody to burn into their soul is that at the time of Bretton Woods, and the reason I think we're a different country now in that conference, in Bretton Woods, back when it happened the first time, right before the end of World War II, we were the largest creditor in the world. We are now the largest debtor in the world. And there's no way that anybody can look at Bretton Woods and go, oh, the largest debtor in the world would be the one that would be able to get their currency put as like the global currency. And so I look at the movements of the BRIC nations and how many more people are trying to sign on to that, including Saudi Arabia. And I say, the G7 now make up 25.5% of global GDP. That's a quarter, man. They make up a quarter. America alone at the time of Bretton Woods was 50%, just America. And so, dude, people can, I'm not asking you to forecast in the future. I'm just saying, look backwards. At the end of World War II, America is the largest creditor and by itself makes up 50% of global GDP. Flash forward, the G7 make up 25% of global GDP and America is the largest debtor. And PS, they're cutting off countries like Russia and saying, we're just going to remove you from the global monetary system, which then Russia goes, a word? Like, we're going to go talk to China. China's desperate to get out from under your thumb. They want to be at least a regional hegemon. We live in now a multipolar world again, and China is a pure competitor to the US. So says John Mearsheimer. Shout out to John, who we want to get on the show. And it's the whole deck is just totally different. And so when I watch the US government say, I'm never going to be able to convince the American people to go to war with Russia on behalf of Ukraine, not even by proxy. And so I'm just going to print money. I'm like, look, all of Keynes' ideas, he was brilliant, but I don't think he appreciated the human proclivity to abuse that power into oblivion. Bringing us back to Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio said there's only so many personality types. That's why history rhymes. And the reality is every time somebody gets the privilege of being the reserve currency, they just end up taking on debt. They can't help themselves. They print to service the debt. And then eventually you hit a point where it just doesn't work anymore and you hyperinflate your own currency because there is a breaking point. And you finally find that breaking point, which is not like you can point to and say, oh, this ratio of debt to GDP, I get it, it's very complicated. But every currency ever in human history ends up hitting that limit. It hyperinflates, they lose their status. And in that moment, you have to have a debt jubilee, and that normally comes at the cost of war. And so I'm just saying, when I look out at the world and I'm like, hey, the US is funding the Ukraine's fight with Russia, that can go badly. Like, first of all, they're a nuclear power. What are we doing? You're not even getting the American people to vote on it. And when you put it in an economic historical context, covered in an amazing book called The Wealth of Shadows.
Wow, that shout out was thank you for that.
Dude, the crazy thing is, I in some ways, I think your book has affected me more than it's affected you.
No, it
Absolutely
has.
fascinating.
I think I'm probably arguing against you more than agreeing with you for conversational purposes, honestly, because I feel like I learn more from arguments than I do from agreements.
Agreed.
And it's more, we both like grow from that experience. But yeah, I think that's a valid point. I think the way the US government has, frankly, in the last 80 years, gotten into the habit of kind of soft declaring wars without congressional resolutions this is not the first time that's been a problem. Ironically, it was Iraq, right, which we were talking about earlier, was a time when Congress did vote and they gave the president authority to launch an invasion, and look how that worked out. So there are difficulties both ways. I think that, again, I don't know that anyone would make the argument that the major inflationary pressures on the American economy right now are the aid to Ukraine. I'm not saying those are helping. I agree with you entirely that they're not. They're hurting. But the COVID era money printing is kind of obviously the prime source of the inflationary pressures the American economy is feeling now. I don't know how you'd make an argument contrary to that.
Agreed.
Which is all to say that's not to say that aid to Ukraine is helping. Again, it's not. That's obviously inflationary. Because again, we're sort of not building things in the United States that we use. And I think it's an interesting example that you're making about, or what you were saying Ray Dalio was making about how other currencies have stopped being global reserve currencies. I mean, sterling really lost that privilege in the Second World War. It wasn't a massive
by getting itself in debt. Yes. What do you mean?
Well, they did get. You're right. They did get themselves in a tremendous amount of debt during the war to the United States, and they also got bombed. It feels like the getting bombed part was pretty bad.
I mean, huge advantage. They had to rebuild America, obviously Pearl Harbor, but basically we walked out of that completely unscathed. So America's geography to the rescue one more time. No doubt about that.
Yes, but I certainly see the argument that it's an interesting way of thinking about it, that the problem, and it sounds like the argument that you're saying Dalio is making, and it's a smart one, is that sterling's problem as a global reserve currency was the debt per se, and not the fact that they nearly lost a massive war and nearly became, a territory of Germany's. I mean, I think we sort of forget, whenever I go back into the early history of the war, and I did this when I was writing this book, and I did this when I was writing The Imitation Game, the film I wrote about 10 years ago, which also gets...
The one you won the Academy Award for?
I did win an Academy Award for it, yeah. Whenever you read through an exercise I recommend to anyone, and actually here, this is slightly tangential, but if you want to feel better about life in 2024, go on the New York Times website. They have I think they call it the Times Machine. You can look back at the sort of physical paper any day in the history of New York Times publication. And something I've done with this book and with when I was doing Imitation Game was just go back and read the front page of the New York Times every day from January 1st, 1939 to January 1st, 1940. If you read the front page of the New York Times every day for that year, or even just skim through it, you will find your hands starting to shake. You will find like a deep anxiety welling up in your chest. I find myself near tears, frankly, half the time going through it, because the sheer level of apocalypse that it looked like the world was facing in that time was something that I haven't known in my lifetime. I'm 42 years old, and I have not, in those 42 years, experienced that level of civilizational apocalypse on the precipice. And certainly, I don't find myself feeling that way in June of 2024. Knock on wood, I don't start feeling that way in July of 2024. But I think, the feeling of whenever we look back on the Second World War, it's very easy to look back on it. We all find ourselves looking back on it, I think, with these kind of rose-colored glasses where it's like, oh yeah, and the good guys won. Of course the good guys were going to win. And if you look at what it must have been like to be alive in the United States, much less Britain, in 1939 or 1940. Not only was it unclear that the good guys were going to win, it was pretty clear that the opposite was going to happen. It did not at all feel like the Americans and the British were going to survive this. And, you look at frankly, the propaganda the British government was putting out at the time when their war started, because after the invasion of Poland, Britain declares war. And their war was going so disastrously badly. I think there's a line actually in the book where I make fun of it, or I have one of the characters making fun of it, because they literally had to put out some press release that was, I'm probably going to mangle the text slightly, but the British government kind of propaganda press release was like, "And in the high seas, our boats have sunk a number of German ships." And in the book, I have a bit where the guys are reading that going, "A number? That's the best they can muster?" Like, they don't want to tell you how many they sunk, because the answer is like 2, and it's so embarrassingly small that they don't even want to tell. They can't even report on how badly the war effort is going on, because everyone will freak out even more than they already are. So I think that sense of this sense of, in both Britain and the United States, that at the end of 39, Britain, actually, there's a scene of this in The Imitation Game. We don't kind of talk about it, but there's a bit where 700,000 British school children were put on trains and sent out of London to the countryside to largely stay with relatives, because they felt that London at the end of 1939 was an unsafe place for children. I mean, this is London. This isn't like some small town somewhere. This is all the children in London got put onto a bunch of trains and sent to the countryside, as many as could possibly stay with relatives. We didn't explain it in Imitation. There's a bit early in the movie where you see Alan Turing. It was a real thing. He was on the train. He happened to be on the train the day that all the children were on it. So he's on a train filled with children. It's a couple shots in the movie, but that we never really explain. But that's what it was, is that he's on a train filled with school children because he's going somewhere the same day that they're all being sent out of the city. I mean, imagine what it would feel like societally if all of the children were sent out of Los Angeles one day. I mean, I have 2 children. I think you don't, but we both know plenty of people with children. There's children around. I mean, culturally, what that would feel like to say, "Okay, bye, kids. We're probably going to get bombed soon. You'll be back soon. Fingers crossed. We hope that we're not all dead in 6 months, but kind of it looks like we're all going to be dead in 6 months." I would argue that sensation also did not contribute to people's assurance in the stability of pound sterling, to bring it back to an economic question.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, war is just savage. And when it's on your land, even more brutal. All right, I want to ask you a question. This is something that I talked about at the beginning of the book, but given that I think your book picks a time in history, but I don't think anything is fundamentally different about the way the government operated then to now.
I agree with that.
In your book, there are spies in the U.S. government. Do you believe there are spies in the U.S. government today?
Hard, easy, yes. Of course there are spies in the U.S. government today. How many people work for the U.S. government?
A lot.
A lot. I mean, how many millions? I don't even want to hazard a guess, because I'm sure I'll be off. But if none of them turned out to be spies, that would be statistically improbable. I think, of course, there are Chinese spies in the U.S. government. Of course, there are Russian spies in the U.S. government. Of course, there are French spies in the U.S. government. I mean, even our allies, it's no secret that we spend a lot of time. It is no secret that the United States spends a lot of time spying on even our own allies. So I think that's, we can have a separate conversation about whether we think that all the money we spend on intelligence services are kind of producing the effects that we're hoping for. If you talk about inflation, and if we accept this Keynesian idea that inflation happens when we're not getting value for the money, we're creating money without corresponding kind of goods and services being produced. There's good questions about how much value the CIA is really adding to, American security and American life. Their track record has not been, certainly not been flawless. But I think, here's another question. Why why do you ask about foreign spies in the U.S. government? Like, doesn't it seem sort of obvious that would be the case and normal?
Yes, I think it is. Not I think. The very reason I'm asking is because your book showed me a vision of the government that did not match the very naive vision that I had of the government, where spies are low-level people working in janitorial services that are paid to grab a couple documents. Seeing a real-life example of an extremely high-level person that has a major impact in World War II for ideological reasons. This is the part that freaked me out. It was not just about money. He was compensated, but this was
Barely
really somebody who just believed in the cause of the other country. Because here's what I see when I look at our government. First of all, America, I love you. You cannot imagine how much. You really can't imagine how much. You've given me everything. I could write love song after love song. I love this country. I love it the most.
That is a beautiful statement to share on the show
man,
right now. I love that, man.
I mean it, and I'm utterly heartbroken that for people, the American flag has somehow become a negative thing, but I grew up in the 80s, baby. And so that American flag swells me with pride. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't do terrible shit. Such seems to be the reality of governments. But with all of my love, what I see when I look out at the government is I see ideological divisions. And this is where my whole thesis around we're all in the grips of ideas. When those ideas cause us to pull in opposite directions, now we have a problem. And I just see people in the grips of ideas that are pulling them in opposite directions. May my small contribution to the world be that I bring on incredibly thoughtful people. I map the way they think. I find and debate the most important ideas of our time. And then hopefully all together, we can begin adopting better ideas that have gone through the fire of criticism, and that we can all be in the grips of ideas that move us to a positive place, which is something you and I haven't talked about, but I've talked about to my audience many times. You have to have a North Star. And I think it is very fair to say my North Star is Pollyannish, but I think you have to have one. And so mine is just human flourishing. So what leads to human flourishing? And with that, I'm trying to look out at the world and be honest about where we are, hyper divided, honest about why we're hyper divided, ideology that's pulling in opposite directions, and then figure out how we bring that all back together. But when I read your book and realized people are in the grips of these ideas, and they really are active right now today in our government in high level positions, pulling in directions that I would be horrified by. And then when I look out at the mainstream media and I just see gaslighting on top of gaslighting, I'm like, oh my God, like all these people that have been complaining for years that literally inside, I was just like, why do people think about politics? Like, put your head down, build something that matters, has always been my response. But that only works when you're standing on solid ground, and I can feel the ground turning into a bit of sand. I don't think we're quicksand yet, but it's sandy. And so for the first time in my life, I just feel like, we need to be addressing these ideas head on, because I can now, in fact, this will bring me into one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is you speak to two sides of my life. You were pitched to us by your publicist. I was like, it's not possible that this guy's into the two things that I'm hyper into. The economic side of the book that you wrote, and then you're a successful screenwriter. I am a currently failed screenwriter. But nonetheless, love Hollywood, love where all this is going. Now, irony of ironies, I am an ideologically driven screenwriter. I only want to tell stories that have a message that I think will make people's lives better. But I look at Hollywood today and I'm like, hey kids, you have to hide the sleight of hand. So when I see something like Disney's Star Wars, I'm like, I get it. Women are rad. They're powerful. We want to celebrate that. We want to make young women feel like they can do anything. But when you have a Jedi that's just a dope Jedi from day one and never has to learn anything, I see the sleight of hand. I see what you're trying to do. And now I can't see the story. I can only see the sleight of hand. And clumsy sleight of hand is why I would say the last however many Disney movies have just tanked. I'm very curious to get your take on the current state of Hollywood.
Oh, man. This might be a harder question than the economic theory in the Second World War. Current state of Hollywood. So, yes, I live this funny life, right, where I spend half of my time writing books and the other half making movies. And I've written 4 novels and 2 films. And working on another now. And so in a way, I sort of have half of my professional life is in Hollywood, so I have the kind of view of someone who's half there, which in some ways is nice because I have a little bit of distance from it. Like I'm not sort of in Hollywood every day. I mean, I live in Silver Lake on the east side of Los Angeles. I'm kind of literally never in Hollywood except today where I get to come see you. The state of Hollywood. I think I honestly haven't seen a Star Wars movie in so long. I can't comment. I just don't know. I'm so
Not
out
your
of it.
shtick, or
It was
they
never,
turned you off?
No, it was never. It was a thing when I was a kid. Like it feels like I remain surprised in some ways that they're enduring popularity. In some ways, I would argue the strange thing is that we're still talking about Star Wars movies. Like that's the thing I'm sort of surprised at. I think a lot of the things, like I remember being super into it as in middle school and high school, again in the 80s and 90s, and I'm from that generation that when the Star Wars movies were coming out, I was too young to have seen them in theaters. So I watched the Star Wars movies on a VHS tape in my dad's apartment. My parents split when I was 7, and my dad, we mostly lived with my mom, but then my brother and I we'd go visit our dad, and he had this little apartment, and he'd sort of put us in the apartment, and then he'd go out. And so my little brother and I would just sit there with like a VHS player and a TV that I'm sure if you watch anything on it now, the resolution quality would be so shockingly low. In some ways, I wonder if I've ever seen the Star Wars movies now, because I'm like, man, I watched those things on VHS tapes on like a 14-inch by 14-inch square television in impossibly low resolution. Who knows what I actually watched all those years ago? I think, and I loved them then. It just didn't sort of stay a part of my life after that. Oh, that's not true. There was an Andor show. That was great. I watched some of that. And that was really, really good. But I'm not sort of up on the current state of Star Wars things.
Have you seen the controversy over the Acolyte?
I am vaguely aware that this exists, but no, I don't know anything about this. There's a controversy?
There is. And so I haven't seen the Acolyte, but I've certainly seen the controversy. And since it fits so well into the same controversy they've been having forever, it is, from what I can tell, Disney has become an ideologically driven company, which, hey, like I said, Impact Theory is an ideologically driven company. But when you do that, you have to be so careful because what the audience wants is just a good story. So to them, the moral of the story, yeah, it should be there, as if for no other reason than I think what makes films work for the human mind is that they are an exploration of a theme. And then in the end, they will come to a conclusion. And in a typical 3-act structure, sort of Star Warsian, Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell way, they will come to a nice, tidy conclusion that gives you a life lesson that you can carry out, the hero's journey. But you shouldn't know what the final conclusion is going to be until the end. And even then, it should feel right, and it should feel subtle, and it shouldn't feel like something that was thrown in your face. And what, from my perspective, Disney in particular, but this is rampant in Hollywood, is they have an agenda. They're going to wear it on their sleeve. They're going to cram it down your throat. They're not even going to explore it. They're just going to state it. So it becomes a sermon. So I'm giving you a sermon about exactly how you should live. And while, again, I respect it, once people can see the sleight of hand, you get into trouble, and it stops being a movie and it starts being a preacher's sermon.
That's interesting. And I can't comment on that specifically. I just haven't seen it and don't know much about it or this controversy. I will say, though, that in general, I guess I would make the argument that all art is ideological, whether you know it or not. So you were talking about Impact Theory being kind of ideologically driven. You have these messages, you have these themes that you want to bring out to people. I think that my work is too. I think that hopefully, and again, I'm going to mangle the source of this quote, but I think it was originally a quote about journalism, and someone can look up who said it. But the idea was that journalism should aim to either comfort the afflicted or afflict the comfortable. And I've always loved this. And I think that's right, that kind of good art should be doing one of those two things. And I don't know that I've achieved this by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like the bit where I get more excited is the afflict the comfortable part. I find myself getting excited about art that changes how I think about something, that doesn't tell me what I already know. Like it would be awfully silly to have written a book about World War II where the thesis was Nazis are bad. No shit. That's not particularly interesting. That's not particularly compelling fiction. And frankly, when we were doing Imitation Game, we got into a lot of these things where that was a movie where, again, do we need a scene where we say Nazis are bad? No. No shit. Everybody knows. Do we need a scene where we say, like, homophobia is bad? No, it's assumed. The movie just assumes that. And that seemed, and in fact, like, something in all the things we've tried to do is kind of have something in it that should hopefully challenge the preconceptions and the ideology of anyone going into it, like to sort of destabilize ideology a bit. It's I think why it's funny, actually. Someone was talking to me, a friend said this to me years ago about work that I was doing, and it's always stuck with me because I found it terribly perceptive. She said, nothing you write ever has any villains in it. Like, you never have any real villains. And I have slowly come to realize over the years that she was absolutely right. Like, because villains are so, because I get bored with them quickly. Okay, they're the bad guy. Like, I don't care. I'm much more interested in characters who are morally complicated. Like we were talking about, this is a book with a guy who's a spy who's doing some pretty awful things, but he's doing them for the right reasons. And his reasons are actually really good. And we're still on board with his reasons. And we're in fact on board with 80% of the dastardly things he does in the book. It's that last 20% with which I think both you and I go, oh gosh, man, I was with you up till now, but now you've taken it a bridge too far. And as we talk about kind of narratives and sort of storytelling that's compelling or interesting, I find that sort of work really exciting where, you're challenging. You don't want to create a set of characters, and maybe this is a Disney thing, I don't know, but a set of characters where you're sort of going like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Because I think whenever you start doing that, if the morality is that obvious, then it's not that interesting. Or at least it's not that, you're not asking that much from your readers, from your audience. I think there are no kind of Nazi characters in this book because it's not, they would just be bad guys. That's not interesting. It's much more, compelling to me to see people who are like Nazi adjacent sympathizers or Americans unwittingly helping the Nazi cause or something like that. Or there's a lot of people in the book who are, they're not even Nazi sympathizers. They're just unwilling to involve themselves. They just want to go about their day and not get involved and not have anything to do with it. And they want to stand in a trolley car and look at their shoes as a bunch of Nazis are kind of marching past the trolley car.
That's the terrifying
in St. Paul.
one.
Yes, they want to just look away. And the morality of that is really interesting to me. I think more so than kind of clear-cut lines in good and evil. Actually what made me think of that, the other day we were asking about Disney storytelling. I have a 3.5-year-old, and I watched Ratatouille with him for the first time the other day. I had not seen Ratatouille in so long. These are my extremely belated plugs for hit movies of a decade prior. Ratatouille, it's great. Oh my gosh, how do we ever forget how great it is? Another movie without villains, even the guys who are set up as villains actually turn out to have really interesting, thoughtful points and be right about a bunch of stuff and kind of turn and change in interesting ways. And you're sort of just as compelled by them as you are by the heroes. I think that was an example of, I can't remember if Disney owned Pixar at the time of Ratatouille, but of that kind of 4-quadrant all-family storyline that still is, I would argue, morally complicated in interesting ways. So I don't know, it's funny, I go, because I'm only half in Hollywood, you're asking about the state of it. Some days I find myself on calls where everyone's tearing their hair out, are people going to go see movies anymore? Maybe this was the end. This is the end of movies. Is it all going to fall apart? But then it seems fine. And I feel like, again, this is sort of looking at history. Every 15 or 20 years, we've culturally had that freak out about movies specifically, in the face of first television and now YouTube, or frankly the kind of media channel that this is, right? Where you're making podcasts, you have a YouTube channel, you're sort of doing all of these, we're in a media environment where you look at like streaming. We always forget this, but you look at streaming video consumption in the United States, and I've seen this data just a little bit, but like, if culturally sometimes we talk about Netflix as being the kind of streaming video leader in the United States, but it's not remotely. It's a fifth of what YouTube gets in terms of views. YouTube is unquestionably the sort of streaming leader in the United States, which is that bad for Hollywood? Is that good for Hollywood? I don't know. It's different. I think I'm excited as a consumer of a lot of, I read a lot of books. I watch a lot of movies. I love books. I love movies. I don't feel a current shortage of things I really like. Like I find myself able to find things and being driven towards things that I really love that I might not otherwise have found, that I can watch really, really easily. And that is very exciting to me. And I hope other people are having the same experience.
Is AI going to be good or bad for the film industry?
I am super bearish on AI. I think it's been widely overhyped. This is good. This is one of my least popular opinions. I feel like my wife and I play this game sometimes where she's like, what is your dumbest, craziest opinion? And maybe my bearishness on AI is that one. I honestly think, and this comes from my sort of having spent some time, because I wrote about Alan Turing, because I've spent some time sort of looking at the history of AI. I think the history of AI for 130 years now, since Charles Babbage on, has been rife with wild overprediction about what AI is on the cusp of being able to do. From the 1880s to Alan Turing in the 1950s to a lot of great researchers in the 1980s, we have been on the cusp of a massive AI revolution so many times before, and I am unconvinced that this is the moment when an actual revolution is occurring, so much as like a bunch of really minor user interface improvements have been created and kind of rebranded as something called AI.
Now, so I am equally bearish in the sense of right now today. Right now today, it cannot do the things that people think it will be able to do or want it to do. But every time I see somebody tweet something like what you're saying right now, I think, but if you just extrapolate, like, okay, so we're now roughly, I think 18 months since ChatGPT launched. 18 months. So in 18 months, we've gone from, whoa, this is crazy, to, oh, look at the photos it can do, to, oh my God, it can do video now, but the video is terrible and it's so weird and surreal and they can't even get the hands right. It's Will Smith eating spaghetti and it's, just like absolutely hilarious, to, whoa, wait a second. I can't now, in a single shot sometimes, I can't tell if this is real or not. They're not, running around, because as soon as they start moving, it gives it away. But these really subtle shots, they're working. Okay, wait a second. If you've just seen literally this week, a new model dropped for Runway ML, it is insane. You've got Sora, which I still don't think is available to the public, but the stuff they've shown, like the puppies playing in the snow, good Lord, it hits the snow and then pulls back and it's got snow on its muzzle and the way it's interacting with its fur is real. And I'm just like, okay, cool. If that's how far we've come in 18 months, how far do we go in another 18 months? But forget 18 months. Where are we in 10 years? I think people are really going to be shocked at where we are in 3 years. But even if you think I'm out of my mind, where are we going to be in 10 years? And 10 years ain't that long.
May I offer a reframing of
Please.
the point you're making? If your point is that in the 18 months since ChatGPT has been released, the number and volume of useless things that it has been able to do has increased, if that is your argument, I agree with you wholeheartedly. They are finding ever newer and more baroque, useless things that this technology can do every day. And I am fascinated both by the technological brilliance, the unquestionable technological brilliance going into these things, and what seems to me like so let's go back to John Maynard Keynes and talk about value and usefulness. And I'm still waiting for someone to give me a real use case. Maybe that would be the point. I'm still waiting for a real use case, because every time someone talks about a use case, it's always, oh yeah, the thing we do now, well, obviously it's useless. It's the thing we'll be able to do in 18 months that's super useful. And I would argue that argument was being made at Stanford and Yale and the Sorbonne in 1982 and 1983. That argument was being made. Frankly, Alan Turing was making that argument in 1951. In 1951, Alan Turing went on a lecture tour of the UK where he was arguing that superintelligent AGI was months away. He was wrong. That did not happen in the mid-50s. Why did he think it was going to happen? It's because the people who, and Alan Turing, again, maybe smarter than John Maynard Keynes, among the kind of great intellectuals of the 20th century. Why was he wrong about AGI? He didn't call it AGI. I forget what his term was, but that's basically what he was talking about. It's because the people who work on this tend to sort of get in the weeds of it, and they get excited by these sort of these like nudging improvements. But again, what is it? Maybe if you're writing code, I've talked to some people who write code for a living who talk about it being actually useful for them in kind of real ways. But look, certainly on the boring old prose fiction side or on the filmmaking side, the people I ask filmmaker friends all the time, I ask editor friends all the time. I was talking to an editor last week, does any of this do anything? Can you do anything with this you couldn't do before? And it's, oh, well, no, of course not. I mean, all this I could do 2 years ago. I could do this all 10 years ago. None of this, no. But look, it's kind of cool. Look, I can push a button and it like adds a dog to the shot. And it's like before, if I had to do that, I'd have to spend a little bit more work because I'd have to use a mat or something. You'd have to kind of do it photochemically or whatever. Like it doesn't. I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of angry letters after this from AI people who are like, no, our thing is really useful. But let me ask you: have you seen someone with a real use case of any of this technology?
Yeah. So this is probably. So some of the way that your friends are bamboozling you, they're not lying to you because of the way you framed the question. But this is probably 6 years ago. I went to a post house and I forget the name of the actress, but she was in a show called Nashville and she was pregnant while they were filming. And the guy goes, watch this. And he pulls her up and tucks her chin in, reduces her belly in front of me. And I was like, what on earth? How did you do that? Obviously, the technology that's running underneath that is AI. It's not AI in the way that we think about it now, but it's AI. So AI has been in all of these tools, whether it's Adobe Photoshop, Premiere, whatever. They've all been adding little pieces of algorithms here and there, which is AI. It's already doing so much. The modern CGI universe brought to you by Under the Hood AI. Everything Pixar is doing brought to you by Under the Hood AI. I mean, they're running all these crazy algorithms to do like the motion in the fur and all that stuff. So the world has been slowly being gobbled up by AI in ways that people don't understand. And so it's this, how do you boil a frog slowly? We hit a critical threshold with ChatGPT where suddenly people were like, oh my God, you've now triggered my imagination. I can see where this is going to be. Now, people's imagination is ahead of them. That is very true. And when we have tried to deploy it to create 3D assets, it's terrible at 3D assets, but it can do it badly. And so what I'm saying is,
it's the best sales pitch for a piece of technology. I want Sam Altman to stand up in front of all of his investors and be like, think of the number of things that we can do badly.
Yes. But what if the difference between doing it badly and doing it well is electricity and training data? Then it is. So I read an amazing book called The Wealth of Shadows. And basically the opening line is, this guy looked at the German spreadsheet and understood it was a mathematical certainty that they would invade Poland. Mm-hmm. And then it was a mathematical certainty that ultimately they would collapse because even if they conquered the entire world, the second they did, their economy would collapse. And what I'm saying is, it is, unless we run out of electricity, it is a mathematical certainty that virtually everything that you watch visually will be generated by AI. Now, it may still require the human soul, the human spirit to tell it what to create. I don't know if it will ever make novel leaps where we watch something and go, oh my God, you made me think of something I've never thought of before. It may not be able to do that. It may only regurgitate patterns, but visuals are simply regurgitated patterns. Now, maybe actors will forever have dots in their face and they can just do a thing that AI will never be able to do. Cool. But the thing that you see on screen, 100% is going to be entirely from top to bottom AI generated. That is from where I'm sitting, that is a mathematical certainty of just, you have to give it enough time. Now, is that time 3 years, 30 years, 300 years? That I don't know. But it's probably closer to 3 than we think.
That's fascinating. And I would push back on that and say, here, my single word response to that is Oppenheimer. My single word response in the last 24 months of film history is that, wow, audiences can in some intangible way appreciate photochemical cinematography in a way that we didn't think they could. Oppenheimer famously shot on IMAX cameras. There isn't CG used in it. Of course, there's plenty of CG used in everything. And that's, I think, both agrees with the point you're making and furthers it, which is that we find that a lot of these visual effects tools, things that used to be sort of visual effects shots, are now just things you're kind of doing in a post house, like you were talking about, removing, kind of changing the shape of an actress's belly, or, and I think the point that you just made that, in a way that might give away the game is when you said that you had that conversation at the post house 6 years ago, and they weren't talking about it as AI. Like, AI is this branding thing that, as far as I can tell, is entirely this like Sam Altman driven, came up with a great branding for a bunch of technology that was largely already there and some minor improvements on that technology. You know, when we made Imitation Game, like a small English period math drama, this was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we were in post on that. And even then we had the ability to, there was something, I remember there was a scene that we cut up. It was shot as one scene and we realized we wanted to put another scene in the middle of it. So we sort of cut a scene in half, but it would be weird to have actors wearing the same clothes in sort of two scenes apart. So we needed to change the color of the dress that the actress Keira Knightley was wearing in the scene. So it's the same footage, but we just put a new dress on her. And this was 11 years ago, 12 years ago. And I thought this was going to be oh gosh, we have to call somebody call ILM, somebody call like a big effects house to do this. And instead it was the assistant editor just said, oh, do you want me to just go in my office and here, just hang for an hour and I'll just come back and do it. And he went to his office on his computer and came back and her dress had a new color. I don't even know how he did it. Some of the software that was even around, again, 10, 12 years ago. So I think this isn't new technology. Some of it has got it in a little bit easier to use. And the idea that audiences are suddenly going to be really receptive to entirely computer generated imagery. I mean, I think what we find, maybe we don't find this, but I certainly find, is that I can tell when I'm watching a movie where the sort of base image is photochemically generated versus something that's algorithmically generated. You can tell in like a kind of shoddily made superhero movie where suddenly they kind of go into the shot where they all look a little bit robotic and like none of it looks quite real and it all looks sort of video gamey, to maybe give away the game by describing it that way. But or you can tell when a film, and Oppenheimer is a great example here, is photographed photochemically with cameras and real celluloid that is photochemically responding to the light in front of it. Why is it that feels different? Audience, and then you can manipulate little bits, right? You change the shape of a belly, you change the color of a dress, you can like change it in little bits, but that fundamentally the image is photochemically generated. Fundamentally the image has been photographed. Can all audiences detect that all the time? No, but I would argue that enough people kind of feel that on some level, even still, with even as good as sort of computer generated imagery is, that it's not like we're at a point where we're saying, is anyone going to watch kind of live action films that are mostly computer generated soon? I'm saying that no one's even aware of, no one even likes watching live action films, any frames of which have been entirely computer generated now. Like we sort of instinctively recoil at those things because we know the uncanny valley of that is still strong. And I think we find this with, so I would argue, frankly, this is something interesting about the funny place in media history we're in, where we thought a bunch of technological improvements were going to kind of fundamentally change really, really old and durable art forms. And we've found actually that the changes have been on the margins, and that they've expanded the realm of kind of what those art forms look like, but not that they've fundamentally kind of kicked the knees out from under them. A great example would be books. A technology as old as time, or not as old as time, right? As old as the printing press. Like we've had printing presses for a while. We've had printed books like the one here for a while. There is no interesting new technology that went into like the printing of a book, or frankly even the writing of it. I'm trying to think of like what technology I've used. Spell check, but even then I still have 3 different copy editors who go through the manuscript, kind of weeding out errors that have escaped the notice of spell check or any kind of grammar editor. So I think we find, and there was this bit kind of 15 years ago when everyone thought that everyone was going to transfer onto ebooks and e-readers, that ebooks, people were going to stop reading kind of physical printed books and transfer and start reading ebooks. And then that didn't happen. They kept buying physical books. And in fact, the percentage of book purchases that have been ebooks has gone down every year for the past however many years. There's something about the quality of it that people like. In a strange way, the conversation that we are having right now, as we sit here today, is a perfect example of this, because we are 2 human beings sitting in front of 2 microphones, kind of talking into a bunch of recording technology to be listened to people on headphones or off of a speaker somewhere. That is 110-year-old technology. We've had radio interviews for, I'm going to say, about 110 years. Maybe it's closer to 100. And what we're finding with frankly, the resurgence of, what we're finding with the recent popularity of podcasts, I would argue, is a resurgence in really old technology. Like there's actually something about radio that people love. There's something, but what the technology has allowed us to do is consume even more radio than we used to, and to consume audiobooks. And actually, in publishing, it's a good example. The real shift that happened when you look at what audiences were doing, what readers were doing, is it's not that people stopped buying print books, it's they also started listening to audiobooks. Because now we have the technology to make that super, super easy. And I'll say, my wife and I had a baby last summer, and our second child. Thank you very much. And I cannot imagine, we have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old now, and I cannot imagine the experience of either child without audiobooks, or like having an infant. Because when you have to stay up all night, and like you get to sleep in these sort of 45-minute little increments, and then you're kind of giving an infant a bottle. And I would just kind of stay up listening to audiobooks while kind of giving the baby bottles and soothing him and putting him in the crib and getting up and down. And I can't tell you how many like great books I got to listen to last summer with an infant in the house that I would not otherwise have been able to read because of that technology. So, and again, this isn't new technology. It's weirdly a new, like people reading books into microphones is really, really old technology. The distribution mechanism is new. The part where I get to listen to it on my phone, and it's super easy to just click a couple things, download it on Audible, start listening in 10 seconds. That's the really new bit. So it's, I know that was a kind of long-winded and kind of varied way of looking at a kind of media landscape, but I would argue that it's this changes in distribution methods are kind of more important. We're finding more important than the changing methods of how stuff is actually created, as evidenced by the fact that you and I are recording right now in the same way. If this was 80 years ago, this wouldn't really look any different. Yeah, you have a tablet in front of you. Yeah, we have video cameras on us, but Johnny Carson did the same thing, right? Like that's not new technology.
I agree. I want to I agree with you that it's not new technology in that fundamental sense, but I'm going to paint a picture for you of what I think the future looks like, and then tell me what you think about that.
Okay. Is this a scary picture or a happy picture?
It is terrifying in that it passes through a valley of despair so traumatic
Oh my God.
that I think it will be a fundamental paradigm shift, and I don't think humans are good at paradigm shifts.
Agreed.
So
All right, I'm in for this journey.
all right, here's what I think happens. So
Okay.
the reason that the argument that you just made is 100% correct and yet not predictive of the future is that the difference is that the new technology that's happening now is intelligence itself. And so if you can imagine what life would have looked like 5,000 years ago, and if I could pull 5,000 years forward so that somebody 5,000 years ago could instantaneously experience 2024, it would be disorienting beyond belief. So they don't have electricity, they don't have TVs, they don't have things that look like telepathy. Like, imagine this. I could say to them, in all honesty, I'm going to go over in that room, and you're going to stay here with Graham. And Graham is going to ask you to give him a number. You're going to give him a number, and then he's going to send it to me without moving his mouth, without making a sound. And I'm going to know what that number is. You can give him a whole sentence. You can give him a whole paragraph, and I'm going to know it instantaneously. And he'd be like, yep, nope, not true. Or it's witchcraft. And of course, you're either just going to record it on your phone and text it to me, or you're just going to write it out and text it to me. It is actual telepathy. But because it happens so slowly, we don't really think about it. Okay, so that would be shocking, but it took a long time scale to really make something shocking. What I'm saying is intelligence, if we get to what they're calling super intelligence. So there's a meme going around, what did Ilya see? So Ilya Sutskever was working at OpenAI, something happens, and he goes radio silent, won't talk to anybody for months. And then the first thing back is, I'm starting my new company. His new company is, if I'm not mistaken, SSI, Safe Super Intelligence. So there's this whole hypothesis that he's seen that AI is way farther along than people think it is, and that now he is just freaked out by what's going to happen if people don't focus entirely around coming up with a way to make AI safe by making sure it wants the same things that we want. It's called alignment. Anyway, so if superintelligence comes into existence, now imagine that in an hour, it can have 100 years of human advancement because it's thinking a million times faster, smarter than we are. And then what happens, to give you an idea, I ran the math on this one time, Einstein is something like 2.4 times smarter than a literal moron. Somebody who scores, well, I think it's 81 or 82, somewhere around in there is the legal definition of a moron. So he was 2.4, I believe that's close, times smarter. So what happens when you have something that's a million times smarter, a billion times smarter? It will be able to bring about a world that not only would be indistinguishable, you could just say, create a movie for me that looks like it was shot on celluloid, that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It will be photorealistic. And because now again, I don't know timeline. So I don't know if this happens in 5 years, 50, 500. But again, it just comes back to, as long as we can generate the amount of compute, which requires the electricity, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to get to that point. I'll never say that it will be able to make genuine leaps of cognition because I don't know if that requires something that humans have. I don't know. I assume it will, but I don't know. But even if it can only recognize patterns, it will be able to do things like say, this is how the proteins are going to fold in your body, right? And so now all of a sudden it can predict the obscenely complicated interactions of the human body. That becomes down pat. Now you can live forever, whatever. So once you give an intelligence that is self-improving, all bets are off. And so that is a world that is just so fundamentally different that it is, as they say, it's the technological singularity. You can't anticipate what it would be like. If you could, you'd build it. So utterly fascinating. But now to narrow our focus back to Hollywood and something that I think is more near term, So I think about this a lot. I'm spending a lot of money to build a studio. And so I'm staring at AI coming down the pipe and I'm like, okay, what's going to be real when? Right now, it can write a screenplay for you, but that screenplay is not inspired by any stretch of the imagination, but it can help you brainstorm, and it's actually pretty interesting for that. It can help you identify patterns. So, hey, of the last 10 Academy Award winning screenplays, what were the structural beats? What was happening on page 7? What was happening on page 27? Whatever. And it will break it all down for you. Utterly fascinating. What were their genres? How many speaking parts, et cetera, et cetera. So you can get a level of data and insight that you wouldn't be able to get. But the real thing that I think is going to happen is society is going to bifurcate. And there are going to be people who are like, I want a movie starring Pikachu set in the Star Wars universe, but based on the visual stylings of these photos from my childhood. And then it will do it. And it'll be like, oh, well, it's crazy. Pikachu lives in my bedroom and this is nuts. And it's telling a story about whatever. You can feed it what you want it to be about. So you'll get people that are like, I want that hyper specialized stuff. And I get it, it's a little off. But I mean, if you've ever watched bad soap operas, you know, there are just some things where people accept it's not great, but I love it. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get people that are, I want the hyper personalization that AI can bring. And I don't care that it's the uncanny valley. Then you have other people that will literally march in the streets. And I don't know if there'll be violence, but they're going to take it very seriously. That I do not engage with anything that is AI driven. I don't watch movies that are AI driven. I don't let my kids watch things that are AI driven. I want the soul of humanity. I want stories that are written by real people. I want real actors. I don't care if it's not personalized. I don't care if there are less of them, whatever. I want it to be real humans. Now, I wore this shirt as a part of this punchline. I wrote a comic book about this, about what I think. Now it's called Neon Future because I think on the other side of this valley of despair, you actually get to, there's no utopias, but you get to the closest thing. I think technology ultimately becomes the thing that saves us. But I think that we are fooling ourselves if we don't think that that bifurcation in society happens. And so the story that I wrote is about that friction, the moment where it's like neither of them have hit escape velocity yet, but you've got the humans on one side saying, we don't like these bad people that are infused with AI, because we focused a lot on people that embed technology into their bodies, like Neuralink style. Mm-hmm. We don't like those bad augmented people. Like that becomes the new class to discriminate against. So we will have to go through that and we'll have to navigate that. And it will be very interesting to see how far the purists go and to see how fast people that augment are able to augment themselves. But I do think that's the path.
I think that is a fascinating scenario. I'm curious to see how it plays out. I would say the part of that I certainly can latch onto is and get behind is the idea that there'll be hugely customizable kind of video and art. Like that you, as you were saying, I want, Pikachu and Batman doing a dance for 4 hours and going on a like Lord of the Rings style quest or whatever, and copyright be damned. I can just sort of make my little videos that only I'm watching and I'm not charging for them, so I'm not violating any copyright, and and I can entertain myself to death with this. I think that certainly seems, and I don't care if it's like uncanny valley-ish. Like I don't care if it's not that good. I think you're right that we are kind of single-digit years away from that being a reality, and I'm curious to see how people respond to that, because I think we find, in my experience, the experiences that I've found with my readers and my viewers has been that the things that people respond to the most are not the things that they said they wanted. It's the things they didn't say they wanted. And I think that's what I would predict will be unsatisfying about art produced that way. That it might be a little bit satisfying and kind of diverting for little periods of time, but it's ultimately not as satisfying to, I don't think that will be as satisfying to audiences as work that they couldn't have predicted. My second book, The Last Days of Night, was about the relationship between Thomas Edison, George Westinghouse, and Nikola Tesla. And the protagonist of that book, of The Last Days of Night, is a guy named Paul Cravath, who was George Westinghouse's patent lawyer. In 1893, George Westinghouse sued Thomas Edison for $1 billion over the patent to the light bulb. In 1893, you imagine $1 billion was the kind of money worth going to court over. And so Paul Crebass was this real guy, and he was the sort of young, untested patent attorney in charge of handling, I think, what I would argue is the most valuable lawsuit in American history. It was all about who invented the light bulb. Was it Thomas Edison? Was it George Westinghouse? Or was it Nikola Tesla? And, in the book, Paul is our sort of narrator and lens into this very complicated story of these three, great geniuses of the late 19th century who, it's no secret, loathed each other. They all hated each other so much, in part because they thought they were each the kind of genius behind this amazing invention. And I think also in part because they had completely different values. To go back to something you were saying earlier, they thought of invention in fundamentally different terms. When Thomas Edison sort of thought that he invented the light bulb, he meant something different by invention than Nikola Tesla meant when he thought of himself as the guy who invented the light bulb, or something different than George Westinghouse meant when he thought of himself as the guy who invented the light bulb. And I'm making this point to talk about how I'm making the point to say this. One of the Thomas Edison quotes when I was working on that book, that I can't remember if it's in the book or not, but it always stuck with me, was at some point he said, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And I think that's true. I think that people, it's like things that are immediately pleasing, and this is sort of my point about that kind of art, it's like things that are immediately pleasing tend to be a little bit ephemeral. It's like exercise or something, right? Like you start that first 30 seconds that you start working out are kind of unpleasant. I don't know if you have this experience, but it's like the first 30 seconds are kind of unpleasant, and then you get really into it. And then after you work out, you feel really good. And I have 2 small children, so I do not work out nearly as much as I used to a few years ago. But my vague memory of a time in my life when I used to get to exercise a lot more was that, it's that initial thing of, this is hard, this is sweaty and painful, and my body doesn't like this, is necessary to get to the point of, this is fulfilling to me in a way that I didn't quite realize that it would be. So that's what I think about when you sort of talk about endlessly customizable kind of video or audio or certainly prose. I'm curious to see what those people who sort of will turn off AI entirely. I guess I'm still sort of so bearish on the idea that AI is even a classifiable thing, that there's some subset of things called, like we've now, everything that we describe as AI, I feel like is stuff that 10 years ago we would have just called like spell check or something. Like it's just like, a little feature in Microsoft Word that does a fun but kind of useless thing. And I'm not sure, calling it AI makes it sound fancier. And I've read Nick Bostrom's wonderful book on superintelligence, which I just loved. Even though I think I disagree with him kind of fundamentally about kind of the possibility of AGI and sort of self-improving AI. And I guess I would just say, this is not the first time these predictions have been made. And I would be surprised if it was the first time they came true.
I love it. This has been a lot of fun, man. Where can people follow you? Where can they get the book?
You follow me through books and the films I make. You and I were talking about this before we turned the microphones on. I'm not on social media, which is perhaps a mistake. Maybe I'll go back on it. I was on it before. I was on it a few years ago, and I got to some point where I felt like for a while, it felt like the ratio of information I was getting to time I was wasting was working in my favor. And then I got to some point where I felt that the ratio had flipped. So I went off it. It's been a couple years. Maybe I'll get back on. But, people are welcome to find me wherever they can.
I love it. All right, everybody. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
You could ask yourself, what do we celebrate? My income isn't going up as an individual. I'm not making more money, but this guy's got $200 billion. The US doesn't know pain. We have no idea. There's a world where we embrace technology,